Around midnight, the sounds changed. Before it had been soft and scattered, but now it was closer. I could hear deliberate footsteps crunching on the dry needles outside, circling the cabin. They weren't fast, but methodical, moving in and out of the shadows. My heart raced. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was an animal again, a bear or mountain lion testing the cabin. But the pattern was too careful, too aware for a wild animal. I felt the weight of isolation pressing down, the realization that I might be completely alone with something unknown outside my door. I remembered I had packed a small hunting knife in my bag. Not ideal, but it would have to do. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was old but functional. The door bolted, the windows latched. I moved the knife to the kitchen table where I could reach it quickly. The steps outside continued, circling, sometimes stopping, then starting again. I kept the fire alive, piling logs so the light would illuminate the clearing. Time passed slowly. Hours dragged as I waited, tense and alert. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The forest went silent again, but the sense of being watched lingered. I stayed awake until dawn, never leaving the fire. When the first rays of sunlight hit the clearing, I ventured outside. The forest was empty. No sign of a human. No tracks in the soft soil. Nothing that suggested anyone had been near the cabin. Only the signs of animals, which now seemed harmless compared to the fear of the night. Over the next day, I stayed close to the cabin, gathering firewood and exploring only the edge of the clearing. I kept thinking about the previous night, replaying every sound. I realized how vulnerable I had been. The forest was beautiful but unpredictable. The isolation that had seemed peaceful now felt dangerous. I made a decision. I would leave at first light the next morning if nothing happened, but I would take precautions. That evening, I took more measures. I reinforced the doors with a wooden beam I found in the shed, placing it horizontally across the main door. I covered the windows with extra boards. I even hung small objects near the edges of the clearing to create noise if anyone, or anything, tried to approach. I told myself these were simple precautions, but they helped me feel in control. Night came again. The forest fell silent at first. I kept the fire burning bright, the knife close, and my senses alert. Around 11 p.m., the steps returned. The pattern was familiar, deliberate, slow. I could hear the faint crack of twigs underfoot. My stomach twisted, my hands shook, but I didn't panic. I watched the shadows from the windows, ready for anything. The steps stopped suddenly at the edge of the clearing. Then I heard a faint scraping sound, like someone testing the cabin door. My heart jumped. I gripped the knife tighter, ready to defend myself. Then, unexpectedly, the footsteps retreated. The sound of movement in the forest faded. Hours passed. By 3 a.m., the forest was quiet again. I stayed awake until sunrise, too wary to sleep. The morning light revealed no signs of human presence. No footprints, no disturbance. I packed quickly, loading the car with everything I had brought. As I drove away, my hands still shaking slightly from the fear and tension of the past 2 nights, I thought about what had happened. It was likely someone had been in the area, a poacher, a hiker, or someone else seeking isolation, but they hadn't tried to confront me directly. They had circled the cabin, tested the area, but left. The feeling of danger had been real, but I had survived. I realized how unprepared I had been for true isolation in a wilderness area. By the time I reached the main road, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The mountains loomed in the distance, beautiful but wild, and I felt grateful for having made it through without harm. I had faced fear, isolation, and the unknown, and had emerged safe. It left me with a deep respect for the wilderness, a reminder that beauty can conceal danger, and that even the simplest precautions can mean the difference between safety and disaster. Weeks later, I still thought about that cabin, that forest, and the deliberate footsteps circling in the night. I never returned, couldn't, but I learned from the experience the value of preparation, vigilance, and respect for nature's unpredictability. The fear I had felt was real, raw, and human, and while it had been terrifying, it had also taught me a lesson I would never forget. Even in isolation, clarity, calm, and careful action can see you through the most frightening situations. I had always wanted to spend a week alone in the woods, away from the noise and clutter of the city. My plan was simple: drive out, rent a small cabin tucked deep into a national forest, and spend my days hiking and my nights reading by the fire. I thought it would be peaceful, maybe even therapeutic. I had done a lot of solo trips before, but something about this cabin felt different. It was advertised as remote, with no cell service, and surrounded by dense forest for miles. The photos online made it look cozy. A small wooden structure with a stone fireplace and a porch that overlooked a clearing. But I knew that once I arrived, reality would feel a lot different from glossy images. The drive out was long, stretching over winding roads that cut through steep hills and thick pine forests. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sky was a pale orange, the sun just dipping behind the horizon. When I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, my car's tires crunched over loose gravel, echoing in the silence of the forest. I hadn't seen another vehicle for nearly an hour. The trees pressed close to the road, branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. I remember feeling a flicker of unease, but I brushed it off. I told myself that this was exactly the kind of isolation I had wanted. Quiet, solitude, no distractions. The cabin itself looked smaller than I imagined when I finally crested the last hill. It was surrounded by tall grass and overgrown bushes, with the forest pressing almost against the walls. There was a small clearing in front, enough to park my car, and a fire pit to the side, ringed with large stones. I unloaded my bag, feeling the cool evening air brush against my face. The first thing I noticed as I stepped onto the porch was the smell of damp wood and earth. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was strong. The cabin's wood had darkened with age, weathered and rough under my fingers as I opened the door. Inside, the cabin was modest. A small living area with a stone fireplace, a simple kitchen corner with an old stove and sink, and a narrow hallway that led to 2 tiny bedrooms. The furniture was sparse but serviceable. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a couple of beds with thin mattresses. Everything looked functional but worn. I flicked on the overhead lights. They buzzed for a moment but worked, and set my things down. I wanted to make the place feel like mine, so I unpacked methodically, placing my backpack on the bed and spreading out my maps and notebooks. As the sun fully set, darkness crept into the forest, and with it came the first wave of sounds. Birds had gone silent, replaced by the occasional rustle of branches, the snap of twigs underfoot, and distant animal calls I couldn't identify. The deeper the darkness, the more the noises seemed to multiply. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement outside the window, a shadow flitting between the trees. I told myself it was nothing, that it was probably a deer or some small forest creature. But my heart rate ticked upward more than I expected. I decided to start a fire in the fireplace. The wood was dry, stacked neatly in a corner, and soon the flames flickered to life, casting a warm orange glow across the cabin walls. I sat in a chair close to the fire, sipping water from a bottle and scanning the forest through the large front window. The clearing looked safe, but the shadows at the edges, where the trees were thickest, seemed endless. I felt a strange pressure, the kind that comes from knowing you are completely alone in a vast place. The cabin, which seemed quaint and inviting in the daylight, now felt like a fragile box in the middle of an immense, dark wilderness. Night deepened, and sleep didn't come easily. Every sound made me tense, the wind rattling through the trees, leaves brushing against the cabin, a faint scuffling on the porch. I tried to rationalize everything: animals, the wind, my imagination. But when the noises grew louder, persistent, I couldn't convince myself that it was normal. Around midnight, I heard the first real warning sign: the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin outside. Not light animal steps, not the random rustle of deer. These were methodical, slow, and steady. My stomach sank. I had made a mistake coming alone. I turned off all the lights, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the dying fire. My hands trembled slightly as I retrieved a hunting knife from my backpack, the only form of defense I had brought. I moved to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. The footsteps continued outside, sometimes pausing, sometimes moving. The sound of breathing, long and uneven, seemed to accompany the movement. I couldn't see anything through the windows, only the dense blackness of the forest. My mind raced, imagining all the worst-case scenarios. A thief, a poacher, maybe even someone who had been living in the forest and didn't take kindly to intruders. Hours passed like that. The footsteps eventually stopped, but the tension never left me. I stayed in the bedroom, knife in hand, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. The next morning, I barely slept, only dozing intermittently to the sound of birds beginning their early chorus. I avoided going outside, peeking cautiously from behind curtains. Nothing seemed out of place. The clearing was empty, and the forest looked the same. But I knew, somehow, that someone or something had been there, testing me, making sure I knew I was not alone. Determined not to let fear dominate, I decided to go for a hike. I wanted to assert control, to remind myself that the forest was my space too. I packed a small day pack with water, food, and my maps, locking the cabin behind me. The trail started easy enough, a dirt path winding gently through the trees. Birds sang, sunlight filtered through the canopy, and the world seemed calm and serene. I tried to convince myself that the previous night was an anomaly, maybe a hiker who had wandered too close or a large animal. But as I moved deeper, I noticed small signs that made my skin crawl. Footprints in the mud that weren't mine, a makeshift lean-to that looked fresh, and even items, like an old tin can, placed in positions that made it seem like someone had been watching me. Someone was aware of me, tracking me, maybe even following me from a distance. The realization made my stomach knot. I hiked for hours trying to push the fear down, but each rustle in the underbrush or crack of a branch sent my pulse soaring. I kept my knife ready, imagining the scenarios in which I might need it. By late afternoon, I had reached a small clearing near a stream. I rested for a moment, drinking water and trying to calm myself. I decided to head back, keeping an eye on the trail for anything unusual. That's when I saw it. A set of footprints leading directly toward the cabin, fresh and deep in the mud. Someone had returned. I panicked, sprinting the last half mile, heart pounding, lungs burning. When I reached the cabin, it looked untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching from the tree line. Over the next day and night, I became hypervigilant. I barricaded doors with furniture, reinforced windows as best I could, and made sure the fire was always lit. Every sound set me on edge. The wind, animals, even the movement of tree branches. At one point, I thought I saw a figure slipping between the trees, keeping just out of sight. The stress was exhausting. I could feel it wearing me down physically and mentally. I had no communication, no help, only myself. I realized that if I wanted to make it through, I needed to act strategically rather than react impulsively. I spent the next few days preparing for anything. I gathered extra firewood, reinforced weak points in the cabin, and even collected rocks and sticks in case I needed to defend myself. I watched the forest constantly, noting patterns, trying to determine if the presence I felt was human. Slowly, I began noticing more subtle signs. Paths through the underbrush, small piles of debris arranged as markers, and impressions in the soil that indicated movement around the cabin at night. Whoever it was, they were careful, patient, and experienced. They were waiting for something, maybe hoping to scare me off, maybe testing my limits. Then, on the fourth night, it escalated. The sound of footsteps returned, but this time they were accompanied by something else. Deliberate knocks on the cabin walls, soft at first, then louder, repeated at intervals. I stayed in the bedroom, listening and holding my knife, every muscle tense. My mind raced, imagining what the intruder wanted or intended. I realized I couldn't stay locked away forever. I needed a plan. In the morning, I packed quickly, leaving no signs of my presence inside the cabin. Bed made, belongings packed, nothing out of place. I took a calculated route through the woods, avoiding the obvious trails that someone might monitor. I moved quietly, deliberately, and constantly scanned my surroundings. Hours later, I reached the main road and eventually a small ranger station. I was exhausted, shaken, and on the verge of collapse, but I was safe. The rangers listened as I explained the situation, nodding seriously. They told me it wasn't uncommon for remote cabins to be targeted by trespassers or poachers, and that they would investigate. They offered me transport back to town, which I accepted without hesitation. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest, the cabin disappearing among the trees. Relief and gratitude washed over me, tempered by lingering fear. I had survived, but the experience stayed with me in every detail. The constant vigilance, the isolation, the awareness that someone had been lurking unseen, watching me. When I finally returned to my apartment, I unpacked methodically, double-checking my belongings, feeling an immense sense of security in walls and locks. The cabin trip had been the exact opposite of what I had envisioned, but it taught me something vital. Nature itself is not threatening, but the humans who hide within it can be, and the mind's perception of isolation and vulnerability can be as terrifying as any predator. I never went back to that cabin, but I never forgot the sensations. The cold fear, the darkness, the sounds that seemed impossible to escape. It remained a vivid lesson in survival, caution, and the stark reality of solitude. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea was simple: escape the city, find a cabin somewhere deep in the woods, and spend a week alone. No phone signal, no internet, no interruptions. Just me, the cabin, and the silence of the forest. I had spent weeks searching online for a place that was remote enough to feel untouched but still livable. Finally, I found a small cabin listed by a private owner, tucked into a valley far from the main road. The photos showed a rough-hewn log cabin, with a small porch, a stone fireplace, and a stream running nearby. It looked isolated, exactly what I wanted. The drive there was longer than I expected. I had to navigate several winding, dirt roads, crossing over creeks on narrow bridges that swayed under the car. Trees pressed in from both sides, dense and dark, casting shadows even in the middle of the afternoon. I listened to the crunch of tires over gravel and the occasional rustle of animals moving through underbrush. There were no signs of civilization, no houses, no fences, just miles and miles of forest. The further I drove, the more my excitement grew, but there was also a tension I couldn't shake. I felt like I was leaving the world behind, and there was something in that isolation that felt both freeing and threatening. I arrived at the cabin as the sun was beginning to lower itself behind the mountains. It was exactly like the photos, rugged and unpolished, but solid. I parked the car on the uneven ground in front of the cabin and stepped out, immediately noticing the smell of damp wood and pine. The stream babbled nearby, its sound oddly comforting after hours of driving. The air was cool and crisp, and there was a smell of wet earth mixed with leaves. I walked around the cabin, examining it closely. The windows were intact, the door locked with a sturdy padlock, and there was a small pile of firewood stacked neatly near the porch. Felt good. This was going to be a week away from everything. I set my bag inside and began to unpack. The cabin was small but functional. A single room with a bed against the wall, a table, and a wood stove in the corner. There was a kitchen area with a small sink and some basic utensils, but no running water. I had known that beforehand. There was an outhouse out back. Everything was basic, but everything seemed in good condition. After setting up, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I wanted to get a sense of where I could go, what I could do, and, frankly, where I might be if something went wrong. The forest stretched in all directions. The trees were tall and close together, with thick undergrowth that made walking difficult. I followed the stream a short way, enjoying the sound of water over rocks. Birds called in the distance, and a deer startled away from a thicket at one point, leaping gracefully into the woods. I wandered until the light began to fade and then returned to the cabin. I started a fire in the stove, which crackled and hissed, sending warmth through the room. I prepared a simple meal, then sat on the edge of the bed, watching the fire and listening to the forest settle for the night. Night in the woods is something else entirely. The darkness is complete, thick and heavy. There are no streetlights, no glow from nearby houses, nothing but shadows and the faint flicker of stars through the canopy. Sounds take on a new dimension. The scurry of a raccoon, the snap of a twig, the low hum of an unseen insect. At first, it was peaceful, but soon I realized how alert I had become, how every tiny sound made me tense. It was late when I went to bed, and I slept lightly, waking often to noises outside. At one point, I thought I heard something moving near the cabin. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, slow. I sat up, listening, straining to hear over the wind through the trees and the creek nearby. The sound stopped, and I told myself it was probably an animal. I had seen deer and other wildlife during the day, and raccoons were common at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I drifted back to sleep, uneasy, but nothing happened. The next morning, I woke early, before sunrise. I wanted to get an early start on exploring the surrounding forest. After breakfast, I packed a small bag with water, a map, some snacks, and my phone. Though I didn't expect it to work, I left the cabin and followed a faint trail I had noticed the day before. The trail led uphill, deeper into the forest. The trees were denser here, and the ground was uneven, covered in roots and rocks. I moved carefully, mindful of every step. A few hours into the hike, I realized I had been walking in a loop. The forest all looked the same, the trees and underbrush blending together. I checked my map and compass, realizing I had underestimated the complexity of the terrain. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps, but the trail was harder to follow than I remembered. By mid-afternoon, I was tired and starting to feel a little panicked. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going. I had assumed I would be fine. The realization hit me. I could get lost out here, and I was unprepared for that. I found a small clearing and decided to rest. I drank some water and ate a snack, trying to calm myself. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The sun was low in the sky, and shadows stretched long across the ground. I realized I needed to get back to the cabin before dark. I decided to follow the sound of the stream I had passed the previous day, hoping it would lead me back. I moved cautiously, stepping over roots and rocks, my eyes scanning constantly for any sign of the path. Hours passed, and the forest began to darken. I still hadn't found the cabin. My heart was racing. I tried calling the cabin owner, but of course, there was no signal. The shadows grew longer, and the forest became a maze of shapes and movement. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush, made me jump. I told myself again it was probably wildlife, but the fear didn't ease. I tried to stay calm, moving slowly, keeping the stream in earshot. At some point, I realized I was completely disoriented. The stream had disappeared, and the forest looked entirely unfamiliar. The sun had set, leaving only the faint glow of twilight. Panic set in fully. I tried retracing my steps, but every direction seemed the same. I found a large rock to sit on, exhausted and frightened. I thought about my options. I could keep moving, hoping to find a path or road, or I could stay put and hope someone found me if they came looking. I decided to stay put. I pulled out my emergency blanket from my bag and wrapped it around myself. I tried to conserve energy, focusing on my breathing and trying to keep calm. The night stretched on, long and oppressive. I listened to the forest, the calls of animals, the whisper of wind through leaves, the distant sounds I couldn't identify. It was terrifying, but I forced myself to think rationally. I knew I had some food, water, and a small flashlight. I needed to stay calm, stay warm, and wait for morning. When the first light of dawn appeared, I surveyed my surroundings. The forest was still dense, but now I could see better. I tried to climb a small rise, hoping to get a view, and that's when I saw the cabin in the distance. Relief flooded through me. I hurried carefully toward it, keeping my energy in check, and finally, hours after getting lost, I stumbled back onto the porch. I was dirty, scratched by branches, dehydrated, and exhausted, but I was back. Over the next few days, I stayed close to the cabin. I made sure I had a clear understanding of the area immediately surrounding it. I explored only in daylight, marking trails carefully and noting landmarks. I reinforced my sense of safety by keeping the fire going, keeping supplies organized, and making small improvements to the cabin's security. Each night, I felt more in control, more able to manage the isolation. The fear that had nearly overwhelmed me in the forest slowly diminished, replaced by a cautious confidence. By the end of the week, I had learned a lot about the cabin, the forest, and myself. I realized how unprepared I had been, how easy it was to get lost and panicked in a place that seemed familiar. I also learned how to navigate cautiously, to pay attention to details, and to respect the environment around me. When it was finally time to leave, I felt a mix of relief and pride. I packed my things carefully, leaving the cabin as I had found it, and drove back down the winding roads to civilization. The trip had been terrifying at times, but it had also been illuminating. I had faced fear, uncertainty, and isolation and had come out of it stronger, more aware, and more respectful of the power of nature. The cabin, the forest, and that week alone had taught me lessons I would not forget. And as I drove away, the sun setting behind me, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and calm. I had survived, learned, and grown, and that feeling stayed with me long after the trees had disappeared from view. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea was simple: spend a week alone in a remote cabin in the woods, far from any town or people, away from the constant noise of life. I wanted isolation, peace, and some time to clear my mind. The cabin was old but solid, built decades ago on a small clearing deep in the forest. It had no electricity except for a small solar panel and no running water. Only a rainwater tank and a wood-burning stove for cooking and heating. The nearest road was more than 2 miles away, and I would need to hike a trail that was little more than a narrow path through thick undergrowth to reach it. I arrived late in the afternoon, carrying a backpack stuffed with food, water, and survival essentials. The air was cool, with the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The sun was low in the sky, the light slanting through the trees in long golden beams. From a distance, the cabin looked small, almost fragile, but up close, the logs were thick and weathered, and the roof was intact. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it, and I felt a shiver, not from cold, but from the strange quiet that surrounded the place. There was no sound of cars, no birds singing loudly, no wind rustling leaves, just a deep, almost oppressive silence. I set down my pack, unlocked the cabin door, and pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old wood and dust. There was a small living space, a wood stove in the corner, a table with a few chairs, and a narrow loft above with a mattress and some blankets. I placed my things down carefully, making sure everything was organized. I wanted to be prepared. I lit the stove and started a small fire to warm the cabin. The smell of burning wood mixed with the earthy scent of the forest outside, and I felt a little more at ease. After setting up, I stepped outside to take in the surroundings. The clearing was roughly 50 feet across, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. Beyond that, the forest stretched endlessly. I noticed the faint tracks of deer and other small animals, but nothing alarming. The sun was slipping behind the trees, casting the clearing in deep shadows. I could feel the temperature dropping quickly. I went back inside, ate a small dinner I had brought, and then spent the evening stacking firewood and preparing for the night. I didn't have a phone signal, which was exactly what I wanted, but it also meant I was completely cut off from the outside world. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I lay on the mattress in the loft, listening to the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant sound of animals moving in the forest. Every snap of a twig made me tense, but I reminded myself that this was normal. The woods were full of life. As the night deepened, I started to hear a faint sound, almost like rustling, outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the trees were still. The rustling continued, soft at first, then a bit louder, as if someone or something was moving deliberately through the underbrush. My heart started to beat faster. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. But the sound had a rhythm to it, a steady pace, not the random scurrying of small creatures. I got up and grabbed a flashlight, carefully opening the cabin door. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, the shadows of the trees stretching across the ground. I scanned the area, shining the beam across the undergrowth, but I saw nothing. Then I noticed the footprints. They were large, booted prints, moving from the treeline toward the cabin, stopping just short of the clearing. I froze, my mind racing. Whoever or whatever was out there, they had seen the cabin and they were approaching. My first thought was to stay quiet and wait. I went back inside and locked the door, double-checking the windows. The fire was low, but I fed it a few logs to keep the cabin warm and bright enough to see inside. Hours passed slowly. I sat near the stove, trying to keep calm, listening to every sound outside. Occasionally, I would hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, but nothing concrete. The worst part was the uncertainty, the not knowing what was out there. I didn't sleep much that night, and when I finally dozed off for short periods, I kept waking up to the faint impression of someone standing just outside the window, watching. The next morning, I decided I needed to investigate. I couldn't just stay holed up in the cabin forever. I grabbed my hiking boots, my pack, and my old hunting rifle just in case. I stepped outside cautiously. The clearing was empty, but the footprints were still there, closer now to the cabin, and some even circled around to the back. Someone had been here during the night, and I had no idea why. I followed the trail a little way into the woods, careful to make noise so I wouldn't be caught off guard. I didn't see anyone, but I found more signs of movement. Broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, and even some discarded food wrappers, likely from previous campers or hikers. The idea that someone had been living or moving near the cabin without me knowing sent a chill down my spine. Over the next few days, I tried to maintain my routine. I gathered firewood, cooked my meals on the stove, and explored the nearby trails during the day. Each time I ventured out, I noticed subtle signs that I wasn't alone. Footprints would appear in places I had already walked, tree bark would be scratched, and occasionally, I would find small piles of rocks that hadn't been there before. I started sleeping with the rifle across my lap, too afraid to leave the door unlocked at night. Every creak of the cabin, every snap outside, made my heart jump. I felt hunted, though I didn't know by whom or why. On the fourth night, the tension reached a peak. I was sitting near the stove when I heard it, a deliberate knock on the cabin door. One slow, heavy knock, followed by silence. My stomach dropped. My hands shook as I picked up the rifle. I didn't open the door. Instead, I listened. The knock came again, slower this time, almost as if whoever it was wanted me to respond. My mind raced through scenarios. Could be someone lost, dangerous, or perhaps someone who had been watching me all week. I decided I could not take the risk of opening the door. I backed away, making sure the firelight fell on the doorway so they could see I was awake and alert. After a few tense minutes, the knocking stopped. I didn't sleep much that night, and when morning came, I decided it was time to leave. I packed my things carefully, making sure nothing was left behind, and loaded the rifle in case I encountered whoever or whatever had been near the cabin. The forest felt different in daylight. Shadows were shorter, colors were brighter, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As I hiked the trail back toward the road, I kept scanning the trees, expecting movement at any moment. I didn't see anyone, but every crack of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth, made my heart race. I reached the road by mid-morning, exhausted and tense. My legs ached from the hike and the stress of constant vigilance, but I felt an overwhelming relief. As I reached the first signs of civilization, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I knew I had survived because I stayed alert, because I respected the unknown, and because I trusted my instincts. Later, when I returned home, I reported what I had found near the cabin to the local ranger station. They investigated and found signs of someone squatting nearby, leaving debris, and watching the area, but the person had already moved on. They told me it was rare, but not unheard of, for isolated cabins to be approached by people living rough in the woods, and that my caution had likely prevented a dangerous encounter. In the weeks that followed, I reflected on the experience. It had been terrifying, but also enlightening. I realized the wilderness was not inherently dangerous, but humans could make it so. The isolation, which I had once craved, had turned into a test of awareness, patience, and survival. I learned the importance of preparation, of listening to instincts, and of respecting the unknown. Most importantly, I learned that fear is a tool. It sharpens senses, focuses the mind, and keeps you alive when danger is near. The cabin itself stayed in my memory, not as a haunted place, but as a lesson in vigilance and respect. I never returned to it, but I kept the memory vivid, recounting every detail to myself and remembering how real, tangible fear can teach lessons that comfort, reflection, and imagination never could. The experience changed me, made me more aware of the world and its hidden threats, and more appreciative of the safety and predictability of normal life. The clarity I gained from surviving that week in the cabin was profound. I realized that real terror isn't made by ghosts or monsters. It's made by the uncertainty of human presence, the unpredictability of the world, and the awareness that sometimes the only thing standing between you and danger is your own caution and preparation. And in that, I found a strange sense of respect for the forest, for the people who moved quietly within it, and for my own instincts that had guided me through one of the scariest experiences of my life. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle being alone. I had gone on short hikes, spent nights camping under the stars, and even done a few solo road trips. But there was something different about the cabin trip I had planned that made me nervous in ways I had not expected. It was a small wooden cabin deep in the forest, several hours away from the nearest town. I had found it listed online. A simple place with no electricity, no running water, and only a wood-burning stove for heat. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. I wanted to get away from the city, from people, from everything that made life noisy. I wanted silence. But what I didn't know then was how real silence could start to feel like a living thing, how it could make you question everything around you, and even yourself. The drive there was long. The GPS signal kept dropping the closer I got to the forest, and I found myself relying on a paper map I had printed just in case. The road became less and less like a road and more like a narrow path, bordered by dense trees on either side. The sunlight was fading, and the shadows between the trees were growing longer. By the time I parked the car at the small clearing near the cabin, the sky was turning a dull orange, and the wind carried a chill I had not expected in early fall. The cabin was exactly as the listing had described. Small, wooden, a single story, with a pitched roof. The front porch was worn, with a few missing boards, but it had a simple charm. I set my bag down and took a moment to look around. The forest was thick, old, and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound your own body makes. I could hear the wind rustling the leaves, the distant snap of a twig, the occasional caw of a crow somewhere far off. But mostly there was nothing, and that nothing was heavy, almost pressing against me, demanding attention. Inside the cabin, I found a small living space with a tiny kitchen corner, a wood-burning stove, and a bedroom that smelled faintly of dust and old pine. There was a small pile of firewood stacked neatly beside the stove, and a single lantern with a few spare candles on a shelf. I unpacked my things slowly, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping up my spine. I stacked the firewood carefully, lit the stove, and tried to convince myself I was just being tired, that the nervous feeling would fade once the cabin was warm. By the time the stove was burning steadily, the sun had disappeared completely, and the forest outside was dark. I stepped to the window and looked out. In the dim light, I could make out the shapes of the trees, thick trunks and branches, all moving slightly with the wind. The shadows seemed deeper, almost like they were swallowing the spaces between them. I felt a twinge of panic, but tried to shake it off. I reminded myself I was alone by choice, that this was exactly what I wanted. I had dinner by the stove, something simple, and then settled in with a book. But I couldn't focus. Every small noise, the creak of the cabin, the crackle of the fire, the distant rustle of leaves, made me jump. I kept telling myself it was normal, that old cabins make noises as they settle, that the forest is alive with wildlife. But there was one sound I couldn't identify, a faint dragging or scraping that seemed to come from outside. At first, I thought it was a branch hitting the cabin, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Came, paused, and then came again. I went to the door and looked out, peering into the darkness. I could see nothing, only the black mass of trees and the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through. I told myself it was a deer or some other animal, but I couldn't hear the familiar sounds of paws or hoofs hitting the ground. The noise felt heavier than that, slower, almost like something large was moving just out of sight. My pulse quickened, and I went back inside, locking the door behind me and checking the windows. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting near the stove, listening. The dragging noise never returned, but there were other sounds. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, something brushing against the side of the cabin. Every time I thought it was the wind, I realized the sound was too controlled, too deliberate. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but the tension in my chest wouldn't let me sleep. By the time dawn came, I hadn't slept a single hour. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I told myself it would help calm me, that moving around in the daylight would make everything seem less threatening. The forest was dense, with trees so close together that sunlight barely reached the ground. The underbrush was thick, full of roots and fallen branches. I walked carefully, marking the path I took with small pieces of ribbon I had in my bag, making sure I could find my way back. I discovered a small creek not far from the cabin, the water clear and fast-moving. I knelt to drink, feeling the cold water on my hands. The forest seemed peaceful in the daylight, even beautiful. Birds called to each other, and the leaves shimmered in the morning sun. But even then, there were moments when I would catch a movement in my peripheral vision. A shadow that didn't belong, a branch that seemed to move too deliberately. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the human mind exaggerates fear, but the feeling lingered. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The firewood I had stacked neatly the day before was disturbed. Some logs were slightly out of place, as if someone had walked around the stove. My stomach dropped. I was sure I had locked the door, and no windows were open. I checked everything again, even the back door, and found no signs of entry. Yet the woodpile being disturbed couldn't be explained away as wind. I spent the next hours on edge, checking the cabin repeatedly. I didn't hear the dragging noise again, but I became acutely aware of every small sound outside. I decided I would stay inside that night, only venturing out if necessary. I reinforced the locks as best as I could, stacked more firewood near the door, and kept the lantern lit. My nerves were taut, and every sound made my heart race. Night came, darker and quieter than the previous one. I kept the stove burning, the heat giving me a small sense of security. Then I heard it again, the dragging, scraping sound. It was slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin, circling it. My hands shook as I checked the windows, but I couldn't see anything. I grabbed a heavy metal poker from the stove and waited, my ears straining. The sound moved closer, paused, then retreated. It was gone for a long while, and I thought perhaps it had left. Then, from outside, I heard a new sound, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the underbrush. Someone was out there, moving slowly, carefully, as if they knew I was inside. Panic surged. I moved to the back of the cabin, keeping the poker in front of me. I realized I had to make a decision. I could stay inside and hope they left, or I could try to escape to the car and drive away. I chose to wait. My reasoning was that any sudden movement might provoke whoever was outside. I listened for hours, the footsteps never coming closer, but never leaving completely. By dawn, I was exhausted, but I needed to act. I waited for the first signs of light, then quietly stepped outside with the poker. The forest seemed empty, but I could see tracks in the dirt, large human footprints. They had circled the cabin, but there was no sign of the person now. My fear was real, physical, pressing down on me. I packed my things quickly, deciding to leave immediately. I double-checked everything, grabbed the essentials, and started the walk to the car. The forest in the daylight still had an oppressive feeling, but it was less threatening than at night. I kept my eyes on the ground, watching for tracks. There were none leading away from the cabin except my own. Whoever had been there had vanished. Back in the car, I sat for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. I didn't want to drive, but I had to. The road back was treacherous, narrow, and winding, but I kept going, my senses heightened, eyes scanning the forest constantly. Every rustle made me tense. I didn't stop until I reached the first town, where people were around and lights filled the streets. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. Looking back, I realized what I experienced wasn't supernatural. There was someone out there watching the cabin, circling it. I never found out who or why, but I learned something important. Isolation makes you vulnerable, even when you think you are prepared. Being alone in a place like that is not about ghosts or monsters. It's about real danger, real people, and your own mind responding to fear. In the days after, I reported the incident to local authorities. They took my statement, checked the cabin, and found signs of forced entry around the windows, though nothing had been taken. They warned me that the area had a few cases of break-ins and people hiding in the forest, using isolated cabins to stay unnoticed. I realized then that my fear had been justified. I never returned to that cabin, and I don't think I will. But I do think differently about solitude now. I understand the difference between peaceful isolation and dangerous isolation. I learned to respect it, to plan for it, and to never underestimate how real danger can manifest in places where you think you are completely alone. Even though the incident ended without physical harm, the fear, the knowledge that someone had been there watching, remains with me. And that memory, the tension, the creeping unease of those nights, will never fully leave me. I survived, and that's a good ending, a clear ending. I got away, I learned, and I lived differently because of it. I remember the day I decided to go to the cabin like it was yesterday. Even though it has been years, the memory of that trip is still sharp in my mind, sharper than any of the city noises I had grown used to. I was craving something quiet, isolated, and simple. Life in the city had become suffocating. Work was relentless. The apartment felt smaller every day, and every conversation seemed shallow. I wanted silence, a place where the only sounds came from nature, where I could feel completely alone yet safe in a structure that felt like it belonged to the woods. I found a cabin online, a small rental in the middle of a forest about 3 hours from the nearest town. The pictures showed a wooden cabin surrounded by tall pines, a small lake nearby, and no other houses for miles. The description said it was fully furnished with electricity, running water, and even a small wood stove. It sounded perfect, like a retreat from the chaos of everything. I packed a bag with simple things: a few sets of clothes, a first aid kit, some canned food, water, a flashlight, a portable charger, and my camera. I had always loved photography, and I thought this trip would give me the chance to capture something pure, untouched. I drove in the early morning, enjoying the way the city slowly disappeared behind me. The highway ended, and a narrow road took me deeper into the forest. Trees pressed in on either side of the road, tall, dark, and dense, so that sunlight only hit the ground in thin streaks. I passed signs warning of wildlife, but I didn't think much of it. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly as it did in the pictures. A wooden structure, weathered but sturdy, with a small porch and steps leading down to a dirt path that went toward the lake. I parked my car and stepped out. The air was cold, damp, and smelled of wet pine and soil. It was quiet in a way that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. I pulled my bag inside, unpacked, and explored the cabin. It was small, just one main room with a bed, a small kitchen area, and a bathroom. There was a loft above with a few blankets and pillows. Everything seemed clean, untouched. I checked the wood stove and the fireplace. There was a stack of logs outside. I felt a sense of satisfaction, a relief I didn't realize I needed. The first night, I stayed up late. I had a fire going in the stove, the smoke curling out the chimney, and I sat near it, reading a book. The only sounds were the occasional snap of wood and the wind brushing through the trees. I fell asleep eventually, feeling calm, completely alone, and for the first time in months, at peace. The next day, I explored the area. The lake was small but clear, reflecting the sky perfectly. I walked along the edge, taking photos of the water, the forest, and the way the light moved through the branches. As I walked, I noticed that some of the trees were scarred, scratched by something large. I stopped for a long moment, staring at the marks. They were deep, almost clawed into the bark, and some of them were fresh. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was probably bears. Bears lived in this region. It made sense. I tried to calm myself and continued walking, keeping my camera ready. I didn't see any animals that day, but I could hear rustling in the bushes every now and then. I chalked it up to squirrels or birds. That night, I stayed up later, trying to capture some long exposure shots of the cabin with the forest behind it. I noticed something strange, though. From my window, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the treeline. I adjusted my focus, tried to see better, but it was gone. I shook my head, thinking it must have been a shadow, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I felt a small shiver crawl down my spine. The following day, I decided to go further into the forest, taking a dirt path that led away from the lake. The trees grew thicker, the sunlight dimmer, and the path narrowed to barely a trail. I found old tire tracks and footprints, but they looked old, worn by rain. I made mental notes of landmarks, rocks, and trees in case I got lost. I didn't carry a map. I wanted to feel free. Hours passed. I was completely alone, the forest silent except for occasional bird calls. That's when I saw it. A small clearing with a makeshift campsite. There were remnants of a fire, cans scattered, and a tattered tarp strung between two trees. I crouched to examine it. The fire had been out for a long time, maybe weeks, and the footprints leading away were faint. I got an uneasy feeling. Someone had been here not long ago, and I had walked straight into it. I took a few photos but didn't stay. I turned back to head to the cabin, trying to keep calm. On the way back, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I told myself it was just the wind or the sound of branches snapping under small animals. But then, distinctly, I heard something walking carefully, but steadily, behind me. My pace quickened. The sound mirrored mine, echoing my steps. I looked over my shoulder. Nothing. The forest was empty. Still, the footsteps persisted for a while, and I started running, the bag on my back weighing me down. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. My heart raced, and I sat down, trying to catch my breath. I spent the next few hours checking every corner of the cabin. Windows, doors, the loft, even the small crawl space under the floorboards. I made sure nothing was inside. My hands shook as I lit another fire. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, maybe the wind, maybe my imagination. But the sense of being watched, of someone or something tracking me, lingered like a heavy weight on my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. The creak of the cabin settling, the wind in the trees, distant animal calls. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I froze, gripping the flashlight. The sound stopped suddenly, then started again, closer. My stomach churned. Whoever or whatever it was, it knew I was inside. I sat in the loft with my flashlight, my phone barely charged, my mind racing. I thought of my options. The cabin doors and windows were locked, and there were no other buildings nearby. I could try to drive away, but that meant leaving the cabin and stepping outside into the unknown. I didn't know if the person outside had a weapon. I didn't know if it was just a hunter or someone with bad intentions. My instincts screamed at me to stay put. Hours passed. I kept the flashlight on, occasionally shining it at the windows to see shadows moving outside. I didn't hear anything for a long time, and then just as I was dozing off, I heard a loud bang against the cabin door. My heart jumped into my throat. Something was trying to force its way in. I grabbed the fire poker from the stove, ready to defend myself. The banging stopped, replaced by slow, deliberate scraping along the door. I held my breath, frozen, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, silence returned. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. I looked outside, and the forest was empty, peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. I carefully checked around the cabin. There were footprints leading up to the porch, large and deep, pressed into the soft ground. But they ended abruptly at the edge of the trees. Whoever it was had retreated, disappeared into the forest. I felt both relief and fear. Relief that I was unharmed, fear that they could return. That morning, I decided I wasn't staying any longer. I packed quickly, taking only essentials, and left the cabin. The drive back was tense. Every sound outside the car, branches snapping, birds calling, made me tense. I avoided stopping anywhere until I reached the town. I reported the incident to the local authorities, describing the footprints, the campsite I had found, and the sounds at the cabin. They took notes and promised to investigate, though they said it was likely a transient or someone living illegally in the forest. They advised me not to return alone. Even months later, I couldn't shake the memory. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the scraping at the door, the silent, watching presence outside. I started taking precautions in my own life. Locks on every door, security cameras, staying aware of my surroundings. But even now, I sometimes dream of the cabin, of the shadow moving just beyond the tree line, of the forest that felt alive and aware of me. Looking back, I realized the trip gave me more than I expected. It taught me that isolation can be beautiful but dangerous, that the world isn't always safe, even in places that seem untouched and quiet. It gave me a respect for nature, for the unknown, for the people who might be out there, hidden in the woods. I never returned to that cabin, and I never will, but I remember every detail of it. The smell of pine, the cold, damp air, the sound of footsteps that weren't mine. And I am still grateful that I walked out alive, with the experience, the memory, and the lesson etched into me forever. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of a quiet weekend in the mountains, away from phones, emails, and the constant noise of the city, had become an obsession. I wanted to escape. The cabin I rented was small but sturdy, tucked into the thick woods at the edge of a mountain ridge. It was the kind of place people passed on hiking trails without noticing, a structure built long ago and left almost untouched. The owner had described it as isolated but charming, with a wood stove, a small loft for sleeping, and a creek running nearby. I had read the description carefully, studied the maps, and even looked at satellite images to make sure it was reachable by the old dirt road. I wanted solitude, and I knew I would get it. The drive up was long and winding, the road narrow and flanked by tall pine trees. There were stretches where the trees seemed to lean over the road, creating dark tunnels of branches that filtered the sunlight into thin, cold stripes. The further I drove, the quieter it became. The radio barely worked, catching only a few crackling stations here and there, and soon I had to turn it off entirely. The hum of the tires over gravel and the occasional crow or squirrel became the only sounds. There was a creeping feeling in the back of my mind, a small awareness that I was moving deeper into a place where nothing else existed except me and the forest. When I finally arrived at the cabin, it looked exactly as it had in the photos. It was small, with weathered wooden siding and a tin roof that gleamed faintly under the afternoon sun. The porch sagged slightly, and there were weeds growing between the planks. A stack of firewood leaned against the side wall. The air was cold and sharp, and it smelled like pine, dirt, and something older, something that reminded me of decaying leaves and moss. The creek was just behind the cabin, its water moving fast over rocks, producing a soft, constant gurgle that was oddly comforting. I parked the car, unloaded my bag, and walked around the cabin. I checked the door locks and windows. Everything seemed functional, though I noticed that some of the boards in the floor of the porch creaked suspiciously when stepped on. I shrugged it off. The cabin was old, but it had character. Inside, it was warm despite the chill outside. The wood stove was small, but the owner had left some firewood stacked neatly beside it. The interior smelled faintly of wood smoke and dampness. The furniture was simple. A small table, 2 chairs, a wooden cabinet with some basic kitchenware, and a narrow bed in the loft with a thin mattress and a blanket folded at the foot. There was no electricity except for a single battery-powered lantern. The cabin had a small propane stove for cooking, and a basic water filter was provided for the creek water. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the stove. The flame was small at first, but gradually it grew, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I took off my jacket, poured a cup of water from the creek through the filter, and sat by the fire to rest. The silence was profound. Even with the fire crackling and the creek gurgling, it was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, making every small noise, like a branch scraping against the cabin or the wind sighing through the trees, startle you. As evening fell, the forest outside darkened quickly. The tall trees swallowed the remaining light, and the sky faded from pink to gray to deep blue. I had brought a lantern and some candles, but I found myself reluctant to turn them on immediately. I wanted to get used to the darkness, to the way the shadows moved along the walls and the way the wind whispered through the cracks of the cabin. But as the night settled in, I began to hear sounds that I had not noticed before. Small rustlings outside, the creek louder than usual, and occasionally the snap of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. It made me uneasy. I tried to reason with myself. The forest was alive, full of animals and the usual nocturnal noises. But there was a rhythm to it, a pattern I could not quite recognize. By the second night, I felt a growing unease. The first day had been long and exhausting, but manageable. I spent the afternoon hiking along a nearby trail, taking pictures, and gathering wood for the stove. The sunset had been beautiful, golden light filtering through the trees, the creek sparkling like liquid silver. But that evening, as I settled in by the fire, I realized the isolation was more intense than I had imagined. There was no sound of cars, planes, or people. Even the birds had gone silent. The wind moved differently here, more deliberately, as if the forest itself were breathing. Every noise from outside seemed magnified. The rustle of leaves, the creak of a branch under some unseen weight, the occasional distant thump that I could not place. I started to feel like I was being watched, not by a person, but by something about the forest itself, the vastness of it. Sleep came fitfully. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the roof and the walls. I would wake up at odd intervals, thinking I heard footsteps on the porch or in the yard, but every time I looked, there was nothing. The darkness seemed heavier than it should have been, the shadows moving in ways that I could not explain. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was all the wind, the small animals, the natural creaks of the old cabin. But each time I tried to sleep, I felt a tightness in my chest, an anxious knot that refused to relax. On the third day, I decided to explore further. The dirt road to the cabin had branched off from a main gravel path, and I realized that the nearest other house or structure was miles away. I packed a small bag with water, food, and my camera, intending to hike a few miles along the ridge. The woods were thick and the trail narrow. Sunlight barely touched the ground in places, creating long streaks of light through the dense canopy. Birds called occasionally, but mostly the forest was quiet, the sound of my boots on the dirt path the only steady noise. As I walked, I noticed signs of animals. Tracks in the mud, the broken branches of shrubs, a distant pile of scat that made me cringe. The forest was not friendly. It was alive, indifferent, and full of things that could hurt you if you were careless. I came across a small clearing with a pond, its surface perfectly still. It reflected the sky and the tall trees around it like a dark mirror. I knelt to drink some water, filtered through my portable filter, and paused to take pictures. The silence here was intense. I could hear nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of insects. Something about the stillness made me uneasy. I got the sense that I was not meant to be here, that the forest had been waiting for me to stumble into this spot, and it was aware of my presence. I shook off the feeling and headed back, trying to focus on practical thoughts. The route, the time before dark, the supplies I had brought. That night, things escalated. I had cooked dinner on the propane stove, the smell of frying vegetables and sizzling meat filling the cabin. I sat by the fire, exhausted but restless. Then I heard it, a faint knocking on the door. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. Another knock, deliberate, slow, not random. I rationalized it. Someone could be lost in the woods. But it was late, and the cabin was so remote. I couldn't see any road leading to it, just the forest. I didn't open the door. The knocking stopped. My pulse slowed slightly, but the tension remained. I double-checked the locks, reinforced the door with a chair, and tried to distract myself by cleaning the cabin and stacking more firewood. Hours later, I heard it again. This time, not knocking, but the sound of footsteps circling the cabin, slow, deliberate. The wood of the porch creaked under the weight. I froze. I told myself it was probably an animal. Deer, maybe a bear? But the weight and the cadence didn't match anything I knew from previous hikes. I could feel my palms sweating, the fire flickering shadows that seemed to move with intention. I stayed very still, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing. I told myself to stay calm. I went to bed but could not sleep, listening to every sound, every breath of wind, every crack of wood. The next morning, I found signs that terrified me. Outside the cabin, near the porch, were prints. Not animal prints. They were boot prints, muddy, large, fresh. Someone had been there during the night. I felt my stomach twist. I was completely alone. The nearest road was miles away. I had no cell signal. I had thought I was prepared, but suddenly all my preparations felt meaningless. The prints led from the woods to the cabin and back into the forest. Whoever it was, they had walked right past my door, right past me as I slept, unnoticed. The rational part of my brain told me it could be a lost hiker, someone harmless. But the other part, the part that refused to calm down, told me that someone had been watching me, that my isolation had made me vulnerable. I spent the day considering my options. Leaving immediately was risky. The dirt road was treacherous, steep in places, and I had no idea if whoever had been near the cabin was still around. Staying meant facing the same threat again. I gathered supplies, packed my car, and prepared for a hike out, deciding I would take the longer, safer main road instead of cutting through the forest. The hike back to my car was tense. I kept scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Every branch snap, every rustle made me jump. The sun was low, and shadows grew long. I thought about what I had experienced, the silence, the footsteps, the prints. I realized that isolation could magnify fear, that even in a realistic setting, the mind could take ordinary events and make them terrifying. I also realized that preparation and caution were my only allies. I finally reached my car, my legs sore, my nerves frayed. I locked the doors and sat inside for a long moment, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. I started the engine and drove down the narrow road, constantly checking the rearview mirror. The forest seemed endless, but gradually the terrain opened, and I reached the main gravel road. From there, civilization slowly returned, houses, fences, power lines. I stopped only once, at a gas station, to buy water and eat something solid. The tension began to leave me as I returned to familiar surroundings. That night, safe in a motel, I reflected on the experience. The cabin had been beautiful and secluded, but the reality of isolation, the forest, and the unknown had made it terrifying. I realized I had underestimated the power of solitude in a place where help was miles away. I also recognized my own resilience. I had stayed calm, assessed risks, and acted prudently. The fear I had felt had been intense, real, but manageable with careful thought and awareness. I learned something important about fear that trip. It doesn't always come from monsters or ghosts. It comes from being exposed, vulnerable, and uncertain in a place where the world around you doesn't obey the rules you take for granted. And I also learned that fear can sharpen your senses, teach you patience, and force you to confront reality in ways ordinary life never does. When I finally returned home, I unpacked my things, cleaned the gear, and looked back at the photos I had taken. The cabin was charming, the forest majestic, the creek beautiful. But in the images, I could see the shadows differently now. I remembered the prints, the footsteps, the silence, and I understood the contrast. Beauty and fear exist together in isolation. That trip had scared me, yes, but it had also made me stronger, more aware of the world, and more cautious, wiser in a way that I carried with me after leaving the mountains. I had survived and I had learned. The experience left a mark on me, but it was not a mark of trauma. It was a mark of survival. I returned to my routine with a new respect for nature, for solitude, and for the small precautions that make a difference between danger and safety. And sometimes, when I sit alone at night, I remember that cabin, that forest, and the weight of being truly alone, and I feel both fear and gratitude for having faced it and lived to tell the story. I had always wanted a place far from everything, a cabin tucked deep in the woods where the world felt quiet and slow. I had spent months looking online, checking out maps and listings, and eventually, I found it. A small old cabin on the edge of a dense forest, with a little creek running near it and no other houses for miles. The photos looked promising. Weathered with siding, a tin roof, a small porch that overlooked the creek. It wasn't fancy, but I wanted simple, not fancy. I wanted a place to be alone, to breathe, to get away from the constant noise of the city. The drive was long. From the last gas station, the road turned into gravel, then dirt, then a barely visible track between thick trees. The GPS lost signal halfway, and I drove slowly, hugging the edges of the track so the tires didn't slip into hidden ruts. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the sun barely filtered through the dense canopy above. The air smelled of wet leaves and moss, damp and earthy, and the sound of the creek grew louder as I parked. The cabin was smaller than I expected. A single room with a loft, a fireplace with a stone chimney, and a kitchen corner with an old stove and a tiny sink. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been used in months, maybe years. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung in the corners, thick and gray. But it felt right. I carried my backpack and a small duffel inside and set them down, letting the silence sink in. I spent the next hour exploring the cabin. There was a small woodpile outside and a path down to the creek, where a rickety wooden dock stretched into the shallow water. The forest stretched around the cabin in every direction. There were no neighbors, no road noise, just the distant sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt a thrill of excitement mixed with a quiet tension. It was the kind of solitude that felt freeing but also made you aware of how alone you really were. I built a fire in the fireplace, stacked the wood carefully, and watched the flames lick the dry logs. Smoke curled up the chimney and filled the cabin with warmth. The air outside was cooling fast. Autumn was setting in, and the nights were already bitter. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, just some canned beans and bread, and ate slowly, listening to the wind in the trees. The sound was soft at first, then louder as it pushed through the branches, making the forest feel alive, almost watchful. Night fell fast and total. The darkness outside the windows made the cabin feel small and exposed. I had a flashlight and a few candles, but I left the fire burning because it made the room feel safer. At some point, I realized I hadn't checked the locks. There were no modern locks on the doors, just an old latch on the front and a rusty bolt at the back. I secured both as best I could and tried to convince myself that it was enough. I lay on the narrow bed in the loft, staring at the ceiling, listening. The creek gurgled in the distance. Occasionally, a branch would snap, the sound sharp and sudden, echoing through the quiet. Somewhere in the trees, an animal moved. I didn't know what. A deer, maybe, or something smaller. The mind tends to invent things when the dark is absolute, and I knew that. But even knowing it didn't stop my heart from jumping each time a sound came too close or too sharp. The first night passed without incident, though sleep was light and fitful. I woke several times to the sounds of the forest, each time gripping the blanket tighter, trying to convince myself that I was safe. By morning, the sun finally filtered through the trees, and I felt a little braver. I spent the day exploring the surrounding area, walking the paths I could see from the cabin, examining the creek and the small footbridges that crossed it. I marked a few areas I thought could serve as emergency exits if needed and made a mental note of how far the nearest road might be. It wasn't far, maybe 10 or 15 minutes by foot if I hurried, but in the dark, alone, it would feel much longer. The second night was when the tension started to build. I was cooking dinner when I heard it. A loud thump, like someone had dropped something heavy outside. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a fallen branch. Then another thump, closer this time, followed by the sound of dragging. My stomach clenched. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly walked to the window. Outside, in the dim light of the porch, I saw nothing. The trees swayed gently, the leaves rustled, but there was no clear shape, no animal large enough to make such noises. I told myself it was probably a deer, caught in a root or something. But then I heard it again, this time at the back door, and I knew it wasn't a deer. I didn't panic. Not yet. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and moved quietly to the door. My heart pounded in my chest, loud and ragged. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Footsteps, light and irregular, moving back and forth. Something or someone was circling the cabin. I spent hours that night in a state of tense vigilance. Every sound made me freeze. Every shadow across the windows made my mind race. I realized I hadn't thought about human trespassers. The cabin was isolated, but not impossible to reach. Someone could hike in from the road or camp nearby without my knowledge. My imagination turned every small noise into a threat, and I kept the poker close, ready to defend myself. By the third night, I had learned to accept the unease, to live with it. I secured the doors with extra measures, piling furniture in front of them, and barricaded the back door as best I could. I placed a few cans and rocks around the perimeter where I thought someone could approach, not as weapons but as an alert system. The noise would tell me if someone came close. I also kept a small notebook, planning escape routes and noting possible ways to signal for help if things went wrong. I slept in short stretches, waking at intervals, listening, analyzing, preparing. The real scare came one night when I was walking to the creek for water. I had brought a flashlight, but the battery was dying. I turned it on, and the beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. The creek was calm, the water barely moving. I knelt to fill my bottle when I heard a distinct sound behind me. Snapping twigs, deliberate and slow. I froze, turning slowly, and there it was, a figure, crouched low, half hidden behind a tree. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it watching me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I remembered every bit of advice I had ever read about staying calm in the wilderness. I slowly reached into my pocket for my phone, but no signal. Nothing. The figure shifted slightly, then disappeared into the trees. My hands shook as I stood, spilling some water from my bottle, and I ran back to the cabin as fast as I could, not looking back. After that night, I realized I wasn't just dealing with solitude or the usual fears of isolation. Someone was out there, someone capable of watching, following, maybe even breaking in. I decided to stay alert during the day, too. I reinforced the cabin as best I could, hammering nails to strengthen the doors, stacking extra wood against vulnerable spots, and keeping a careful watch over the forest. I didn't venture far. I stayed close, constantly scanning, planning. The following days were tense. I learned the rhythm of the forest, the sounds of animals, the way the wind moved through the trees. I could distinguish between deer footsteps and human footsteps. Each night, I listened more closely. The figure never returned openly, but I knew it was there, observing, testing, waiting. My sense of time warped. Days blended into nights. Nights stretched endlessly. I kept detailed notes about every sound, every movement. Then, one day, I noticed something new: footprints. Not animal tracks, but human, barely visible, pressed into the soft earth near the creek. They were small, but deliberate, leading toward the cabin. I followed them carefully, making mental notes. They stopped near the edge of the porch. Someone had been close. I didn't panic, but I knew I couldn't stay any longer without taking serious precautions. I devised a plan to leave. I packed my essentials quietly, making sure nothing looked out of place. I timed my exit for just before dawn, knowing the figure would be less active when it was still dark but too dim to move easily. I left a note for authorities. placed in a visible spot for any neighbor or ranger who might check later. Then I walked the track to the main road, staying low, moving slowly, never turning my back. By mid-morning, I reached the road and finally found a passing car. I flagged it down, explaining briefly where I had been. They agreed to take me to the nearest town. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear as the cabin disappeared behind the trees, the forest swallowing it back into silence. Weeks later, the police investigated. They found evidence someone had been watching the cabin for months. The previous owner had similar reports of intrusions. The person had never been caught, but they left signs of their presence. Footprints, makeshift campsites, discarded food, and sometimes broken items at the edge of the property. I never went back. The cabin, once a dream, became a memory of fear, a lesson in solitude and awareness. I realized that being alone in the wilderness is not always about nature. It's about being prepared for the unexpected, for human threats you might never see until it's almost too late. I learned how fragile safety can be, even in a place that looks peaceful. And I never underestimated the weight of silence again. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The city, with its constant noise, fluorescent lights, and endless obligations, had been wearing me down for years, and I needed a break. When I found a small cabin for rent, deep in the mountains, I thought it would be the perfect place to unwind and disconnect from everything. The photos online made it look isolated but cozy, surrounded by dense forest, with a small creek running nearby and a dirt road that led to the front door. I didn't expect luxury. I expected solitude, and solitude was exactly what I wanted. The drive up was longer than I expected. The GPS stopped giving directions about 20 miles out, leaving me to follow a narrow, winding dirt road flanked by trees so close together their branches overlapped above, forming a natural tunnel. The sky was gray that afternoon, clouds heavy with the promise of rain, and the wind whispered through the trees in a way that felt alive, though I told myself it was only the forest making noise. My car's headlights cut through the mist, and I noticed more than once that the sound of my tires on the gravel seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in a place where no one else should have been. I arrived just as dusk was falling. The cabin was exactly as pictured, maybe even smaller and more compact than I imagined, but there was charm in its simplicity. A wooden porch ran across the front, with a single rocking chair and a pile of firewood stacked neatly against the wall. Smoke from the chimney suggested that someone had been there recently, or maybe it was left for effect, but the smell of wood smoke was comforting in a way that reminded me of childhood camping trips. I parked, grabbed my bag, and approached the door. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old wood and pine. It was sparsely furnished, a small living area with a couch that looked stiff and a wooden table with 2 chairs. The kitchen area had the basics: a stove, a sink, and a small fridge, all slightly worn but functional. A single bedroom with a small bed and a thin mattress occupied the back of the cabin, and the bathroom was tiny but adequate. I unpacked my things, stacked my groceries on the counter, and lit a fire in the stone fireplace to take the edge off the growing cold outside. Night fell quickly in the mountains. Within an hour, darkness had swallowed the forest, leaving only the occasional flicker of moonlight through the trees. The cabin felt insulated, but not insulated enough. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every groan of the settling structure, made me aware of how alone I was. I told myself it was only the wind, the cabin shifting naturally, nothing more. Still, I could feel tension coiling in my chest, a nervous energy that made my pulse sharper. Sleep did not come easily. I lay on the bed, listening to the rain that had begun to fall softly on the roof. The sound steady and calming in theory, but somehow it made the dark outside feel heavier. I felt like someone or something was moving in the shadows of the forest, just beyond the edges of visibility. I tried to rationalize it. Bears, maybe deer, or just the wind moving the trees. But there was a certain rhythm to the noises that did not feel random, a sense of anticipation that prickled at my skin. I awoke sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of a scraping noise at the door. My body froze. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but distinct enough to pull me from sleep. Someone or something was moving outside, I told myself it had to be an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a bear moving the firewood. Still, I could not shake the sense of being watched. I stayed in bed, eyes wide in the dark, listening. The scratching returned intermittently, slow and deliberate, and then stopped entirely. I forced myself to breathe, convincing myself it was nothing, before eventually dozing off again. Morning brought a false sense of relief. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest wet and glistening in the early sunlight. Mist clung to the low valleys between the trees, and the air smelled of damp earth and moss. I decided to take a walk along the path near the creek, hoping the movement would calm my nerves. As I walked, the sounds of the forest were alive. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the water running over rocks. For a while I felt at ease. I even laughed at myself, realizing how my imagination had inflated every little noise in the night. But the unease never truly left. By the time I returned to the cabin, I had noticed footprints in the mud, large, heavy boots, leading up toward the cabin and disappearing toward the back. They were too big to be mine and too purposeful to belong to an animal. My heart started racing. I walked around the cabin, trying to find any sign of someone hiding, but there was nothing, no movement, no figure in the trees, just the prints slowly fading into the forest. I told myself it had to be someone who had come before me, maybe a hiker, someone else renting cabins in the area. Still, a gnawing anxiety took hold. That evening, I built the fire again and tried to occupy myself, reading a book and making dinner. But every shadow seemed longer, every sound amplified. The wind shifted and knocked branches against the side of the cabin with a sharp, startling crack. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the window, a flash of something between the trees. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath, but it vanished. My mind raced with possibilities. A trespasser, an animal, someone lost. I felt trapped. My phone had no signal, so calling for help was impossible. The return trip should have been simple. I thought I knew the trail and I had my compass. But as I walked, I began to notice something wrong. Small landmarks I had passed earlier, the shape of a fallen tree, a bend in the stream, looked different. Shadows stretched oddly in the late afternoon sun. I paused to check the compass and realized I might have veered slightly off the main trail. Panic rose in my chest. I turned back, trying to retrace my steps, but soon realized that I was disoriented. The trail split, twisted, and disappeared under thick undergrowth. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into the unknown. I felt sweat bead on my forehead, even though the air was cool. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I could find the cabin. I remembered seeing a ridge earlier that overlooked the clearing near the cabin. If I could reach that high point, I might spot the cabin from above. The climb was difficult. The forest floor was slippery, strewn with rocks and roots. I had to grab branches and roots to pull myself up, and my hands and clothes quickly became scratched and torn. Every sound made me flinch. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and once I thought I heard a low growl. My pulse raced. Could have been a bear, a large dog, or even a wildcat. But it also could have been nothing, just my imagination feeding off fear. I pressed on, determined to reach the ridge. Finally, after what felt like hours, I emerged onto a small outcrop overlooking the valley below. Relief washed over me as I spotted the cabin in the clearing, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. I felt a surge of hope and energy. I scrambled down the slope, careful to avoid slipping, and finally made it back to the cabin as the sun dipped below the mountain line, casting long, ominous shadows. The relief of seeing the cabin was immense. I locked the doors, double-checked windows, and sat by the stove with a heavy sigh. I was exhausted, physically and mentally. My clothes were dirty, scratched, and damp from the climb. My body ached in ways that reminded me I was not as fit as I thought. I prepared a simple meal, ate quickly, and then tended to the fire. I stayed awake for a while longer, listening to the forest and trying to calm my mind. Slowly, the anxiety that had been building all day began to fade. I reminded myself that I had made it back safely. The forest was wild and unpredictable, yes, but I had survived. I had been careful, and my preparation had kept me safe. I slept better that night, though I still kept the flashlight and knife nearby, instinct hard to shake. The next day, I focused on practical matters. I cleared the area around the cabin of fallen branches, organized supplies, and repaired small damage to the porch railing I had noticed the previous day. The weather was calm, the air crisp, and the forest seemed almost peaceful compared to the previous day. I decided to take a shorter walk, just a small loop near the cabin, keeping within sight of the clearing. I wanted to regain confidence and test my limits. Everything was quiet, but not unnervingly so. I noticed deer tracks near the creek, a raccoon scurrying up a tree, and the occasional hawk circling above. By evening, I felt accomplished, having completed tasks around the cabin and explored safely nearby. I prepared a larger fire, cooked a proper meal, and watched the flames flicker. The forest had not lost its danger, but it no longer felt threatening. I had learned how to navigate it, how to respect it, and how to stay safe. By the time I left the cabin, I had a deep sense of accomplishment. The drive back down the mountain seemed easier now, my body sore but my mind clear. The isolation had been challenging, frightening even, but it had also taught me resilience and awareness. I had faced fear, exhaustion, and the unpredictability of nature, and I had come out unharmed. I drove away, the cabin shrinking behind me, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. That trip had reminded me how small and fragile I was in the wilderness, but also how much preparation, careful observation, and determination mattered. It was not a fantastical story, not a supernatural encounter, but it had been real, tense, and raw. I left the forest with a sense of respect and understanding, carrying the lessons of fear, patience, and preparedness with me. The memory stayed with me for months afterward. Every time I walked into a city street full of noise and distractions, I remembered the quiet of the forest, the feeling of standing on that ridge looking down at the cabin, and the relief of having made it back safely. That trip taught me more than any city experience could, about endurance, attention to detail, and how fragile control can be when nature decides to assert itself. I could never forget the fear I felt, the pounding of my heart as I struggled to navigate lost trails, and the small, intense joy of regaining safety. It was terrifying, yes, but it ended clearly. I returned alive, intact, and stronger for it. No ghosts, no fantasy, only reality and the lessons it carried. And that clarity, that completeness, was more satisfying than any storybook ending could have been. I had always been drawn to the isolation of the forest. There was something about the quiet that felt complete, a kind of emptiness that allowed me to think, to breathe. I had grown tired of cities, of people everywhere, of the constant noise. So when I found the small, abandoned cabin listed for rent in a remote stretch of the northern woods, I jumped at the opportunity. The place was old, certainly decades past its prime, with dark, weathered wood and a thin layer of moss covering the roof. From the outside, it looked like it might collapse in a strong wind, but there was a certain charm, a promise of peace. It was far enough off the main roads that I would likely not see another person for days. That was exactly what I wanted. I arrived late in the afternoon, my car rumbling over the uneven gravel and dirt road that led to the cabin. The last stretch of path was narrow, almost entirely covered by overgrown brush and fallen leaves, and I had to push past branches scraping the sides of my car. The air was crisp and dry, and there was a scent of pine, wet soil, and the faint decay of fallen leaves. I remember parking the car and sitting for a few moments just to listen. The forest was almost silent, except for the occasional rustle of wind in the high branches. There was no one around, no cars, no voices, just the faint creaking of old trees and the distant call of a crow. The cabin's door was heavy, made of thick, dark wood, with iron hinges that had rusted over the years. I had a key, but it took effort to turn it. Inside, the air was stale but not unpleasant. The smell of old wood mixed with a hint of mildew. Dust hung in the air in thin motes, visible in the shafts of late sunlight filtering through grimy windows. The cabin was small, one main room with a stone fireplace at one end, a narrow kitchen area along one wall, and a loft above that could serve as a bedroom. Everything inside was coated with a thin layer of dust and cobwebs, but it was functional. I had brought supplies: food, water, blankets, and some basic tools, and I unpacked everything carefully, trying to imagine what life here would be like over the next week. The first night was eerily quiet. I sat by the fireplace, which I had managed to get lit despite the dampness of the old wood, and felt the heat push back against the chill seeping through the cabin walls. The darkness outside was absolute. The trees pressed close, their branches casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. I slept fitfully, my mind restless from the drive, the isolation, and the subtle sense of unease that came with being somewhere so remote. But it was not fear, at least not yet, just the awareness of being entirely alone. The following morning, I woke early, before the sun had fully climbed over the horizon. I made coffee on the small camping stove I had brought, the hiss of boiling water strangely loud in the silent cabin. Outside, the forest was already alive with movement. Birds flitted through the trees, squirrels darted along fallen logs, and a thin mist clung to the forest floor. I decided to explore the area around the cabin, mostly to stretch my legs and take note of landmarks. The forest was thick, the ground uneven, covered with roots and rocks, and the occasional patch of mud that made my boots slip. I moved cautiously, not because I feared anyone else, but because I was aware of how easy it could be to get hurt out here and how far away help would be if something happened. I found a small stream about 50 meters from the cabin. The water was clear, running over smooth stones, and I filled my water bottles, letting the cold liquid run over my hands. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic, the sound of water filling the silence around me. I marked the path back to the cabin in my mind, noting large trees and an unusual, half-fallen pine as markers, because I knew that in this forest, it would be easy to lose one's bearings. Over the next day, I settled into a rhythm. I chopped firewood, cleaned parts of the cabin, organized my supplies, and took another long walk through the woods. By the second evening, the isolation started to feel heavier. There was a weight to the quiet that I hadn't anticipated, the kind that presses on your ears and fills your mind with shadows. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me pause. I told myself it was just the forest, but my body tensed at the sound of distant footsteps. Not human ones, I was certain, but something larger. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. I had read about black bears in this area, and I knew they could be dangerous, especially if startled. The third day brought the first real scare. I had gone a little farther than before, following a faint game trail deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, the underbrush thicker, and the light dimmed quickly under the canopy. I was watching for signs of animals, noting tracks in the mud, when I heard a sharp crack behind me, like the sound of a branch snapping under a heavy weight. I froze. Nothing in my experience could have prepared me for the sudden awareness that I was utterly exposed in the middle of a forest with no one around. My heart raced as I turned slowly, scanning the trees. There was movement, a dark shape slipping between the trees. It was a bear. Not huge, but solid, its fur dark and shaggy. I froze, remembering everything I had read about how to act if confronted. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on it, avoiding sudden movements. The bear made no aggressive sounds, but it did not retreat either. My mind raced with plans. How far was the cabin? Could I outrun it if it charged? Could I climb a tree fast enough? I realized that there was only one safe move. Stay calm, move slowly, and put distance between me and it while avoiding startling it. After what felt like an eternity, it lost interest and melted back into the forest, leaving me trembling and drenched in sweat. By nightfall, the sense of being watched had become unbearable. I lit every lamp in the cabin, keeping the fire burning high, and checked all the doors and windows repeatedly. Around midnight, I heard it again, a slow, deliberate tapping on the porch. Not random like the wind, not soft like an animal, but heavy and measured. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, my hands shaking. The tapping stopped, Silence followed, long and heavy. My pulse was deafening in my ears. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, every sense alert to the forest outside. The next morning, I decided I could not stay any longer. The unease had escalated into a tangible fear. I packed my things quickly, trying not to make noise, and checked the cabin one last time. The forest seemed calm in the daylight, deceptively peaceful, but I did not trust it. My car had one problem. The battery was almost dead. I had noticed it starting sluggishly the day before, but now, with the cold and the damp, it refused to turn over. My heart sank. I tried multiple times, rocking the car, adjusting the connections, but it would not start. Panic started creeping in. I was alone, deep in the mountains, with no phone signal, no help, and the cabin behind me now a place of dread. I tried to think rationally. The nearest town was miles away. I could walk, but the forest was dense and unfamiliar. Still, I could not sit there and wait, not after last night. I grabbed a backpack, filling it with essentials: water, food, flashlight, matches, knife. I decided I would hike to the nearest road. The forest that morning was deceptive. It seemed ordinary enough to mislead me into thinking I was safe. But the trail I tried to follow was barely a path, overgrown with ferns and fallen branches. Every step I took seemed to echo unnaturally, every snap of twigs making me flinch. I could not see the cabin anymore. It was swallowed by the trees behind me. I kept walking, heart pounding, aware that anyone, or anything, could be moving around me in ways I could not detect. By midday, I had lost the path entirely. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and still alone. The forest had begun to feel oppressive, each tree like a silent sentinel observing my struggle. My mind played tricks on me. Shadows moved where nothing should be moving. Every animal noise sounded like something bigger, something deliberate. I reminded myself to breathe, to stay calm, but the tension had built into a pressure that was almost physical, as if the air itself were closing in. After hours of wandering, I found a small clearing. In the distance, I could see what looked like a road, a strip of gray cutting through the green. Relief surged through me. I ran toward it, stumbling over roots and rocks, falling more than once. My hands and knees were scraped, my clothes torn, but I did not stop. I had to reach safety. Finally, I reached the road. It was real, a proper asphalt road, though deserted. I followed it, hoping for a passing car. After what felt like an eternity, headlights appeared in the distance. I waved frantically, and the car slowed. I ran into the lane, waving my arms, desperate. The driver stopped and helped me into the car. I tried to explain, breathless, my words tumbling over themselves, and they nodded, understanding without needing details. They gave me water, a blanket, and drove me to the nearest town, where I contacted the authorities. They took a report, though nothing could be done immediately. The footprints at the cabin, the noises in the night, they had no immediate explanation. I never went back to that cabin. I later learned that the area had occasional reports of break-ins and lost hikers, and I realized how lucky I had been to escape when I did. I now tell this story not as a tale of supernatural horror, but as a reminder. Isolation magnifies fear, and the forest can be both beautiful and unforgiving. Solitude is powerful, but it can become dangerous when combined with the unknown. I learned that I am capable of calm and action under pressure, but also how fragile safety can feel when removed from the familiar. The memory of those nights, the darkness pressing against the cabin, the deliberate noises, the untraceable footprints, stays with me, a vivid, lasting lesson in caution, awareness, and the fragile nature of being alone in the wild. I never returned to a cabin alone, and I never forgot the sound of tapping on the porch, even when I was far away. It had been real, it had been terrifying, and I had survived. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks, maybe even months. After months of endless work, noise, and city life, I craved silence, a place where the only interruptions would be wind through the trees or the occasional bird song. I found a small, remote cabin listed online, tucked away deep in the mountains. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure with a porch, surrounded by towering pines and a little clearing where sunlight broke through the canopy. The description promised privacy and solitude, exactly what I needed. I packed my car meticulously, making sure I had all the basics: food, water, clothes, a first aid kit, tools, and a small wood stove for heating. My mind was set on a few days of peace and reading, away from the hum of everyday life. The drive up was long, winding along narrow mountain roads that hugged cliffs and plunged into valleys. My car's tires crunched on gravel, and every turn seemed steeper than the last. The GPS signal dropped in and out, making me rely on printed directions I had brought as a backup. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, I felt a rush of relief and excitement. It was smaller than I had imagined but sturdy, with a stack of firewood piled against the side and smoke stains on the chimney, evidence that it had been used recently. A rickety wooden bridge crossed a shallow creek leading up to the porch. I parked the car and stepped out, inhaling the scent of damp earth and pine. The air felt fresher, colder, and somehow heavier with quiet than I remembered from the city. The first few hours passed in a pleasant blur. I unpacked, stacked firewood near the cabin's small stove, checked the water source nearby, and walked around the clearing, marveling at how alone I felt. The forest surrounded me like a wall, so dense that I could not see more than 50 feet in any direction. Birds chirped sporadically, and a squirrel darted across the underbrush, freezing before disappearing into the trees. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. I prepared a small dinner on a portable stove and ate while watching the sun sink behind the mountain peaks, turning the sky into streaks of orange and red. I felt content, happy even, as the cabin filled with warm, golden light. Night fell faster than I expected. The forest became a dark, shifting mass of black shapes and shadows. I lit the cabin stove and stacked logs, listening to the occasional creak of the wooden walls as they settled. That first night, the wind picked up and rattled the window frames, and I realized how deeply I had underestimated the isolation. Out here, every small sound seemed magnified. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the scurrying of some small creature outside. At one point, I heard something heavier, like a large animal, moving through the underbrush, and my stomach tightened. I reminded myself that bears were common here, that I had read about it, and that I had taken precautions. I had food sealed tightly, scented items in the car, nothing outside. Still, the feeling of being watched gnawed at me, prickling the back of my neck. Sleep was fitful. Every snap of a branch outside my window made me tense. I kept imagining a bear or a mountain lion lurking just beyond the tree line, waiting for me to step outside. I kept my flashlight by the bed, my hiking knife within reach, and my phone on the nightstand. The battery was full, and I had service just enough to call for help if needed, but it was spotty, so I would have to rely on myself if something went wrong. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into shallow, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I had a rough idea of trails nearby from the map, and I wanted to see a waterfall that supposedly existed a few miles from the cabin. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, a compass, and my first aid kit. The trail began as a narrow path through tall ferns and thick underbrush. The air was cool, almost damp from the previous night's rain. The forest floor was slippery in places, covered with wet leaves and moss. I kept my eyes on the path but could not help noticing how silent it was. Birds sang sparingly, and there was a general stillness that felt unnatural. Occasionally, I would hear a distant thud, like something heavy dropping to the forest floor, and my heart would skip a beat. I kept telling myself it was a deer or a fallen branch, nothing more. Hours passed as I hiked. The trail wound up and down small ridges, sometimes climbing sharply, other times dropping into narrow valleys with trickling streams. I admired the scenery, but unease began to creep in. The deeper I went, the more I realized how easily someone could get lost. The trail markers were few, faded, and sometimes hidden under overgrown ferns. I checked my compass often, making sure I was heading roughly in the right direction. Around midday, I stopped to eat a snack near a small creek. The water was clear, cold, and refreshing. As I leaned over to fill my water bottle, I noticed something unusual. Footprints. They were large, irregular, and not human. I froze, heart pounding. They seemed fresh, pressed into the damp earth and mud. I looked around, trying to see if there was any sign of the creature, but nothing moved. I decided not to panic. Bears roamed this area, and it was likely just that. I finished my snack quickly, packed up, and continued. By mid-afternoon, I reached the waterfall. It was beautiful, cascading over rocks into a small pool surrounded by moss-covered stones. The sound of water was soothing, a temporary relief from the tense feeling that had been building all day. I sat on a rock for a while, letting the cool mist touch my face. But even here, isolated in the middle of the forest, I could not shake the feeling of being observed. I scanned the trees, looking for movement. Nothing. Still, every rustle of leaves, every cracking branch made me tense. I decided to turn back toward the cabin before the light faded, knowing the forest would become treacherous in the dark. I made it back to the cabin, my nerves frayed. I spent the evening reinforcing the cabin's perimeter as best I could, stacking firewood near the windows and doors, and keeping the fireplace burning. The forest felt different now, less like a serene retreat and more like a wild, unpredictable place. Shadows seemed to move just a fraction too fast, and the wind that whistled through the trees sounded almost like a warning. I couldn't sleep well that night, lying awake listening to every sound outside, my mind replaying the bear encounter over and over. The next days blurred together in a mixture of careful routines and growing tension. I was vigilant, checking the perimeter, keeping the fire going, and rationing my supplies carefully. The isolation began to wear on me. The forest was beautiful, yes, but also alien, filled with sounds that I did not understand and shapes that my brain insisted were moving even when they were not. I would catch glimpses of animals, deer, foxes, the occasional raccoon, but my attention was always drawn to the unknown, the possibilities of danger. I began carrying a hunting knife at all times, and I kept a small hatchet by my side whenever I ventured outside. On the 6th day, something changed. I had gone to collect water from the stream again, taking a slightly different path to explore, when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not animal footprints, but human. Fresh human footprints leading toward the cabin. I froze, scanning the area. The forest was quiet, too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. The prints were large, heavy, and uneven, indicating someone had come through the area recently. I traced them for a few meters, but they vanished into the underbrush. My first instinct was fear. This cabin, this place I thought would give me peace, suddenly felt like a trap. I realized that someone else could be out here, and I had no way to call for help. Cell service was weak, unreliable at best, and I had left my satellite phone in the car. I returned to the cabin quickly, making as little noise as possible, and double-checked all the doors and windows. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I had not before. That night, I sat by the fire, knife and hatchet within reach, listening. Every sound was amplified in my mind. The wind, the trees, the occasional rustle of leaves, and I was sure I could hear footsteps, faint but deliberate, moving just beyond the cabin. I did not sleep. I could not. The 7th day was the worst. I woke to the sound of something heavy scraping against the cabin door. I stayed completely still, my heart hammering, listening as the noise stopped, then started again, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Whoever it was testing me, feeling out the cabin, deciding whether to enter. I had a crude plan. If they broke in, I would use the knife and hatchet, make as much noise as possible, and then try to escape through the back window if I could. But the thought of facing someone in this isolated place, with no backup, was terrifying. I spent hours observing from the loft, trying to spot movement outside. The figure finally appeared just after noon. A man, tall and wiry, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the shadows. He circled the cabin, never fully approaching, testing the ground, the door, the windows. I stayed hidden, barely breathing. Eventually, he moved off into the woods, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. I waited a long time before daring to step outside, and when I did, the prints were still fresh. I gathered my few belongings quickly, stripped down the firewood, and prepared to leave. I hiked back to the car as fast as I dared, keeping my eyes on the trees. The forest seemed endless, threatening, every shadow a potential threat. By the time I reached the gravel road, I was exhausted, trembling, and soaked with sweat. I started the car, feeling a wave of relief as the engine roared to life. I did not look back as I drove away, my focus entirely on leaving the forest and never returning. Once I was back in a town several hours away, I reported the incident to the local authorities, describing the cabin, the footprints, and the strange man who had been circling it. They took the report seriously, telling me they would investigate, but I never returned to the cabin. It was not worth the risk. Looking back, I realized how naive I had been to think I could find complete solitude in a forest like that. The peace I sought came with real dangers, wild animals, unstable terrain, and the very real possibility of encountering other humans with unknown intentions. The forest was beautiful, but it was wild, unpredictable, and completely indifferent to me. I learned that isolation is not always peaceful, and that survival requires constant awareness, planning, and respect for the unknown. That experience stayed with me. It changed the way I viewed solitude, safety, and the forest itself. I still love the woods, but I no longer romanticize them. I prepare, I stay aware, and I never underestimate the power of being alone in a place that is not under my control. The cabin itself, with its creaking walls and moss-covered roof, remains a stark reminder that beauty and danger often coexist, and that being alone is a choice that must be made with caution and respect. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: disconnect from everything, spend a week alone in the woods, and reset my mind. I work in a high-pressure environment in the city, and every day feels like I'm walking on a thin wire, balancing deadlines and responsibilities. I needed silence, space, and time to breathe. I had found a cabin online, located deep in the mountains of northern Vermont, surrounded by forest and far from the nearest road. It was small, rustic, and described as off-grid, which for me was exactly the appeal. I wanted isolation. The drive was long, more grueling than I had anticipated. The highways gave way to twisting mountain roads that were barely wide enough for a single car. I passed occasional signs warning about deer and moose, but traffic was minimal. By the time I reached the final turn, I was driving on a gravel path that led up a steep hill, trees pressing close on either side. My phone had no signal, which I had expected. I had packed extra food, water, and supplies, so it didn't matter. I reminded myself I wanted solitude. The cabin was even smaller than I had imagined. It was a simple wooden structure with faded brown planks, a tin roof, and a small porch. The windows were dusty, and the door had a basic latch with a padlock. There was a woodpile neatly stacked to one side and a small path leading to a creek in the woods. The air smelled crisp and damp, the kind of smell that sticks in your lungs and makes you feel alive. I unpacked my car methodically, placing the bags inside the cabin. I had brought canned food, a small camping stove, water jugs, a first aid kit, and blankets. I set the stove up in the kitchen area and lit a small fire in the wood-burning stove in the corner. The cabin had electricity, but it came from a small solar panel on the roof, and I knew it was unreliable, so I planned to use it sparingly. The first night was calm. I ate a simple dinner of beans and rice, sitting by the fire as it crackled. Outside, I could hear the forest come alive. The rustling of leaves, distant bird calls, the occasional snap of a twig. I fell asleep early, exhausted from the drive and the hike up to the cabin. I woke before dawn the next morning to a strange feeling. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of unease in my chest. I had heard noises outside, a branch scraping against the cabin, perhaps a deer moving through the undergrowth, but then I realized it wasn't normal. The noises were heavier, deliberate, slow. I got out of bed quietly, trying not to make any sound, and crept to the window. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so. I could see a figure moving among the trees, not fast, just pacing. At first, I thought it was someone else staying nearby, but there were no other cabins in the area, at least none that the map indicated. The figure was too large to be an animal, but too obscured by shadows to see clearly. My chest tightened. I stepped back from the window, convincing myself it might be a trick of the morning light, a branch swinging in the wind. I spent the day trying to keep myself busy. I chopped some wood for the stove, collected water from the creek, and explored the small area around the cabin. Everything seemed normal, the forest beautiful and quiet, the sun piercing through the trees in scattered beams. But the feeling of being watched never left me. By nightfall, it returned. The noises outside were louder, closer. A scraping at the side of the cabin, a soft crunch on the gravel path. I stayed by the window again, peering into the darkness. I could make out shadows moving between the trees. Whoever or whatever it was, they were waiting, circling. My mind raced. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that I was overreacting. But the rational part of me, the part trained to read people, to notice patterns, told me this wasn't imagination. I spent a long night in a chair next to the stove, fire crackling, peering through the windows, listening. The noises didn't stop. At some point, I think I dozed off for a few minutes, and I woke to the sound of the door handle rattling. My heart stopped. Someone was trying the door. I froze, watching the shadows outside move closer. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and held it tight. The latch held, thankfully, but the panic in me was so strong I could barely breathe. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed alert, watching the woods, listening to the branches snapping under careful footsteps. I thought about leaving, but the road was long, and it was dark, and I didn't know if the person or people outside had vehicles. I was trapped in the cabin, vulnerable and alone. Morning came slowly. I could see no one outside, no footprints, nothing to indicate anyone had been there. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it had been someone hunting illegally, maybe it had been local kids playing pranks. But a part of me knew it was different. This wasn't a one-time scare. The pacing, the watching, the deliberate approach to the cabin, it was all too methodical. I spent the next day fortifying the cabin. I stacked extra logs in front of the door, moved heavy furniture against the windows, and prepared myself mentally for another night. I stayed alert, listening constantly, aware of every small sound outside. By the second night, the sounds had changed. The pacing had become slower, more deliberate, as if whoever it was testing me, trying to gauge my reactions. At some point, I saw a shadow pause near the edge of the clearing, and it felt like it was staring at me. I realized I couldn't wait for help, couldn't wait for the morning. I had to act. I remembered the map I had studied before coming, the fact that a ranger station was about 10 miles down the mountain. I couldn't drive. The person outside might intercept me. I packed a small bag with essentials, water, a few cans of food, the first aid kit, a flashlight, and decided to move on foot at first light. I stayed awake all night again, listening, waiting for the first light to guide me. At dawn, I slipped out quietly through the back of the cabin, careful to avoid the front door where the intruder had been watching. The forest was dense, but it offered cover. I moved fast, listening for sounds behind me. Occasionally, I would freeze, holding my breath, trying to hear if anyone was following. The first mile was exhausting. The forest floor was uneven, covered in roots, fallen branches, and rocks. But I kept moving, telling myself that safety was ahead. After a few miles, I stumbled onto an old logging path. It wasn't maintained, but it was easier to navigate than the dense forest. I kept walking, my muscles aching, my lungs burning. The sun was higher now, and the intruder had not appeared, at least not visibly. I tried to focus on the map, on the ranger station, trying not to think about the nights in the cabin. I had walked for hours when I heard voices in the distance. I froze, unsure if it was a ranger or another threat. I crept closer, staying low, and realized it was a group of forest rangers checking traps and wildlife cameras. Relief hit me like a wave. I ran the last few hundred yards, waving my arms frantically. They saw me, called out, and rushed over. After I explained my situation, they took me back to their station. They were calm but serious. They asked about the cabin, the location, and the signs of intrusion. I gave them everything I could, and they told me that there had been reports of an individual or group illegally tracking and harassing hikers in the area. Apparently, they had been using abandoned cabins to observe and scare anyone who came near. I felt a mix of fear and relief. The threat was real, but I had survived. The rangers accompanied me back to my cabin with reinforcements. We found evidence. Footprints, flattened areas where someone had been camping nearby, and makeshift traps. Whoever had been watching me had been careful, but not careful enough. They had left traces that would help authorities track them. I packed up the cabin under the ranger's supervision, taking only what I could carry safely. The rest of the day was spent hiking back down the mountain with the rangers. I was exhausted, sunburned, dehydrated, but safe. When I finally reached the ranger station at the base, I felt the first real sense of relief I had experienced in 3 days. I was exhausted but alive. I called my family from a landline, letting them know I was safe. In the following weeks, I recovered physically and mentally. The incident left a mark on me, a deep awareness of how vulnerable you can be when you're alone and isolated. But it also left me stronger, more cautious, and more appreciative of simple safety measures. I returned to the city with a renewed sense of perspective, carrying with me the lessons of the forest. Always respect the wilderness, but never underestimate human danger. I never went back to that cabin, and I never planned to, but I learned that fear is not always about the unknown or supernatural. Sometimes, it is very real, very human, and very close, and surviving it requires focus, courage, and clear action, even when every instinct tells you to freeze. I had been planning the trip for months, choosing the cabin with care, checking every map, every online review, and reading up on the area. I wanted solitude, a true escape from the constant noise of city life. The cabin was small, old but solid, tucked deep into the forest near a ridge overlooking a frozen lake. The reviews were sparse, and the directions were convoluted, winding down long, narrow, dirt tracks. That had been part of the attraction. The more isolated, the better. I wanted a place where I could be alone with my thoughts, my notebooks, my camera, and the forest itself. I never expected it to feel like a trap. The drive there had been long. The sun was just slipping below the horizon as I turned off the main road and onto the gravel path. The forest closed in around me almost immediately, tall pines lining the track, their long shadows stretching across the ground. The only sounds were the tires crunching gravel and the occasional rustle of wildlife. I arrived at the cabin just as the last of the daylight disappeared. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by trees that rose like silent sentinels. It was exactly as described, rustic but well-maintained. The woods smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and the windows reflected the deep green of the forest. I parked, unloaded my gear, and took a long moment to just breathe in the silence. The kind of silence that fills your ears, almost heavy with expectation. I had expected quiet, yes, but there was something deeper here, almost too still, as if the forest was holding its breath. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small kitchen, a loft bedroom, a wood-burning stove, and a single chair by a window facing the lake. I set my things down carefully, lit the stove, and unpacked a few essentials. The first night passed without incident. I cooked a simple dinner, checked my maps, and made a fire. The wood crackled, the shadows of the trees flickered against the walls, and for the first time, I felt the isolation fully. There was nothing else out there, at least in theory. I slept soundly, though I could hear the occasional distant snap of branches or rustle of leaves. I told myself it was animals. I had no reason to doubt it. The next morning, I woke early to a mist rolling over the lake, the water calm and gray. I went for a walk, camera in hand, noting the tracks in the damp soil near the water's edge. Deer likely. The forest felt alive, but in a way that was almost clinical, each sound sharp and precise. I spent the day hiking the trails near the cabin, taking photos, jotting notes in my journal, and gathering small pieces of firewood. Everything felt normal, almost idyllic. By the third day, I began to notice little things. Small items in the cabin slightly out of place, a chair angled differently than I had left it, a kettle moved a few inches. I had no one else there. I checked the locks, the doors, the windows. Everything was secure. My mind tried to rationalize it. Wind? Animals? But the cabin was solid, and the doors closed tightly. Nothing should have moved. The unease grew slowly, a creeping sense that I was not entirely alone. I ignored it at first. I focused on practical tasks, collecting water from the nearby stream, cleaning up, photographing the wildlife. But every evening, when the sun set and the forest darkened, the feeling grew. I would sit by the fire, listening, and hear things I couldn't immediately identify. Soft scraping, faint footfalls on the wooden floor, a quiet shift of air. It was never immediate or violent, just subtle, deliberate enough to draw my attention. On the fourth night, the wind rose, whistling through the trees. The forest outside was alive with sound. Branches banging against each other, leaves rustling, and a distant cracking that might have been a tree limb falling. I sat in the chair by the window, the only light in the cabin coming from the fire. I felt exposed, small. The isolation that had drawn me here now felt like a trap. That night, sleep eluded me. Every noise felt magnified. Every shadow in the corner of the room seemed to stretch and twist. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, the human mind creating patterns and shapes where there were none. The next morning, I went for another walk, this time following a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The further I went, the quieter it became, and soon, I felt the same subtle shift of awareness from the previous nights. I was being watched, not by eyes I could see, but by something in the forest itself, something moving and observing from the periphery. I picked up my pace and returned to the cabin, feeling a tension I could not shake. That afternoon, I found footprints near the back of the cabin. Small, human, but not mine. The ground was soft from the recent rain, and the impressions were clear. I studied them, trying to determine if they were old or recent. They were fresh. Panic began to creep in, but I forced myself to think rationally. I was deep in the woods, no one lived nearby. It had to be someone passing through, maybe hunters, maybe hikers. I checked my maps. The nearest road was several miles away. Anyone coming here would have had to know the cabin existed. I spent the day securing the cabin as best I could, double-checked locks, moved heavy furniture against doors, stacked firewood near the windows to block entry points. The sun was fading when I heard it, a sound distinct from the usual forest noises. Footsteps, deliberate, heavy, circling the cabin. I froze. The fire crackled behind me, the shadows dancing on the walls. I could hear movement outside, slow, measured, stopping and starting. I wanted to call for help, but the cabin was deep in the forest. Cell service was unreliable at best. Hours passed. I stayed close to the stove, an axe at my side, listening. Every few minutes, the movement outside would start again. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, footsteps pressed against the porch. The sense of being watched became unbearable. I realized then that this was not just an animal or a random hiker. Someone had been following me, observing, planning. The forest, once serene and beautiful, became a cage. I had been planning the trip for months, and by the time I finally left, I was so consumed with anticipation that I barely noticed how early it was in the morning. The sky was still dark when I drove out of town, the roads nearly empty, lined with frost-covered grass and the last stubborn leaves clinging to skeletal trees. My cabin was tucked deep in the forest, far enough from the main roads that I would have a true sense of isolation, but not so far that help would be unreachable. At least that was what I told myself. I had never been to this area before, and the map on my phone showed winding, narrow paths, some so thin that they seemed more like dirt trails than actual roads. Still, the thought of solitude, of silence, of being completely alone in a place that had no neighbors within a mile, thrilled me. The drive took longer than I expected. The roads became rougher, gravel crunching beneath my tires. Small streams crossed the path, shallow enough to drive through but enough to slow me down. As the sun rose, the forest came alive with muted light filtering through dense branches. Every so often, I would see a deer step cautiously from the undergrowth, freeze when it saw me, then bound away silently. The cabin was supposed to be in a clearing near a small lake. That was the plan, at least. GPS reception came and went, and I had to rely on the paper map I had printed, folding and refolding it with greasy fingers as I checked my location every few minutes. Finally, after nearly 3 hours of slow driving, I arrived. The clearing was larger than I expected, and the lake was narrow but calm, reflecting the brightening sky. The cabin was older than the pictures online had shown, but it had a solid, rustic charm. Logs stacked unevenly yet sturdy, a stone chimney, and a porch that ran along the front. I parked the car nearby and unloaded my bags, my boots crunching on the fallen needles and leaves. The first thing I did was check the cabin's interior. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the air smelled of dust and old wood. The furniture was sparse but sufficient. A table, a few chairs, a sofa that looked like it had seen better days, and a small wood stove in the corner. There was a stack of firewood next to it, dry and ready to burn. I placed my belongings in the bedroom, which had a narrow bed and a small dresser. The windows had thick curtains, which I opened to take in the view. The lake glimmered in the morning sun, and the forest beyond was dense and quiet. I unpacked some food and supplies, then decided to take a walk around the clearing. The forest floor was soft with decaying leaves and pine needles. Birds called from the trees, and the occasional squirrel darted across my path. As I moved deeper, I noticed signs of wildlife. Tracks in the mud, broken branches, and scattered feathers. I reminded myself that while the forest seemed peaceful, it was also wild and unpredictable. That thought kept me alert. Back at the cabin, I decided to make a fire. Lighting it was easier than I expected. The wood caught quickly, filling the room with warmth and the comforting scent of burning pine. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling flames and watching the smoke curl up the chimney. It was peaceful, but I felt the first flicker of unease. Being alone in a place like this was different from solitude in my apartment or even in a city park. Here, the sounds of the forest were amplified. The wind rustled the trees in ways that sounded like footsteps, and every distant crack made my stomach tighten. That night, I slept fitfully. I had left the curtains open, and the moonlight illuminated the room. Shadows moved across the walls as the trees swayed outside. Every noise seemed louder, sharper. Around midnight, I woke to a sound at the cabin's door. It was soft, almost a scrape, like a branch brushing the wood. My heart started racing. I sat up, straining to see in the darkness. The fire had died down, leaving only a faint glow from the embers. I convinced myself it was nothing, probably just a branch or an animal. Still, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before trying to sleep again. The next morning, I woke early, determined to shake off the unease. I decided to explore the area more thoroughly. The lake was larger than it looked from the cabin, and the far side was bordered by thick reeds and fallen trees. I walked along the shoreline, noting tracks in the mud, small animal prints, some bird footprints, and larger prints that looked like deer. Nothing alarming, but I noticed one pattern that made me pause. A set of human footprints leading into the woods from the lake. They were old, partially washed out by rain, but they were definitely human. I felt a strange mix of curiosity and apprehension. Who would come here, and why? I returned to the cabin and tried to focus on practical matters. Chopping more firewood, organizing my supplies, and cleaning up the cabin. The physical activity was comforting. By evening, I had built a larger fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in for the night. I kept a kitchen knife nearby, not because I thought I would need it, but because the awareness of being alone in the forest made me feel vulnerable. The second night was worse. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time outside the cabin, moving slowly around the perimeter. I froze, listening. The sound stopped and started again, circling the cabin. My mind raced. Could someone have found the cabin? Was I being watched? I remembered that I had cell service here, patchy but enough to make a call. I quietly pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The line was clear, and the dispatcher listened as I explained my location and situation. They assured me someone would check in if necessary but told me I should remain inside and lock all doors. I hung up, my hands shaking, and stayed awake for the rest of the night, watching the dim shadows outside the window. The following morning, I decided I had to investigate. I knew the forest better now, the paths more familiar. I packed a small bag with essentials, including a flashlight, my knife, a bottle of water, and a whistle. I followed the footprints I had seen by the lake. They led deeper into the woods, toward a slope that descended into a narrow valley. The terrain was rough, and the underbrush scratched my arms and legs, but I kept moving. The prints eventually led to an abandoned cabin, smaller and more dilapidated than mine, with broken windows and a sagging roof. The door hung open on its hinges. Inside, the cabin was empty, but signs of recent use were evident. A makeshift bed of blankets, scraps of food, and a small fire pit outside. Whoever had been here was gone, but I could feel their presence lingering. I took photos and notes, then returned to my cabin, more cautious than ever. Over the next few days, the sense of unease grew. I kept noticing things that didn't fit. Small disturbances around my cabin, footprints near the door that weren't mine, faint sounds in the distance at night. I stayed vigilant, setting up rudimentary alarms with cans and string around the perimeter. Despite my fear, I refused to leave immediately. I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle solitude, that I could navigate the forest safely, that I could rely on my own judgment and strength. Then, one afternoon, while gathering firewood, I saw movement through the trees. A figure, distant but unmistakable, watching me. My first reaction was panic. I retreated carefully to the cabin, making sure to stay out of sight. I secured the doors and windows, then sat in the corner, listening. Hours passed. The figure did not approach, but I knew it was there. I realized that hiding or fleeing might provoke someone desperate or unstable. I needed a plan. The next morning, I packed essentials and left a note in the cabin explaining my location and intentions. I drove the car closer to the main road, keeping an eye on the trees. The figure did not appear. When I reached a place with consistent cell service, I called the local sheriff and explained everything. They sent a patrol to check the area and asked me to wait at a nearby lodge until they arrived. I did. When the officers came, they found no one near my cabin, though they noted signs that someone had been there recently. They promised to increase patrols in the area, especially after dark. I returned to my cabin only after a few days during daylight, fully aware of the risks. I stayed only until sunset each day, avoiding night altogether. Over time, the signs of the other person vanished, and I was able to enjoy the forest and the lake more safely. By the end of the week, I had accomplished what I set out to do. I experienced solitude, faced real fear, and navigated a situation that tested my instincts and judgment. I left the cabin with a mixture of relief and pride. Driving back through the winding roads, I felt a deep respect for the forest and the quiet, mysterious forces that shape it. I knew I had been lucky. The experience stayed with me long after I returned to the city. I kept the photographs, the notes, the memories of walking through the silent woods, feeling watched and managing my fear. I realized that the true challenge was not the isolation itself, but the awareness that the world is full of unpredictable human and natural dangers. I had faced them and emerged intact, stronger, more cautious, and more appreciative of the ordinary, everyday safety I had once taken for granted. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a break from everything, a chance to escape the noise and the crowds of the city. I had been stressed for months, and the only thing I wanted was solitude, the kind that only comes with being somewhere isolated, where the nearest neighbor might be miles away and where the forest presses close enough that you can feel it breathing around you. The cabin I rented was advertised as off-grid, which at first sounded perfect. No distractions, no obligations, no people. Just me and the wilderness. I packed carefully, taking only what I thought I'd need. A sleeping bag, some canned food, a small camping stove, a first aid kit, plenty of water, my notebook, and a flashlight. I drove for hours along narrow, winding roads, past stretches of dense trees and rolling hills, until I finally saw the cabin, almost hidden among a tangle of evergreens and maples. The cabin was small, built of rough timber logs, with a simple tin roof and a stone chimney. It looked sturdier than I expected. There was a small porch with a couple of chairs and a woodpile stacked neatly beside the cabin. The door was heavy, and the lock creaked when I turned it. Inside, it smelled of old wood and a faint hint of smoke from someone having lived there before. The furniture was sparse but practical. A small table, a couple of chairs, a bed in the corner, and a wood-burning stove that looked like it could warm the place well enough. There were some shelves with old, dusty books and a few kitchen utensils tucked away in a cupboard. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to absorb the silence, the emptiness that felt so different from the city's constant hum. The first night was quiet in a way I wasn't entirely used to. There was no hum of electricity, no distant traffic, no lights from neighbors. Only the wind brushing against the trees, the occasional crack of a branch breaking somewhere far off, and the soft, persistent rustle of leaves. I felt comfortable enough to light a small fire in the stove, letting the warm smell of burning would fill the room. I made a simple meal of canned beans and bread and then retreated to the bed, listening as the night stretched long and silent around me. The next morning, I woke early, to the dim gray of dawn filtering through the narrow windows. I made coffee on the stove, listening to the birds starting their tentative songs. I decided to take a short walk to explore the surrounding area. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick forest, and I wandered among the trees, noting the moss-covered trunks, the scattered rocks, and the small creek that ran somewhere nearby, its sound muffled by the undergrowth. I didn't see anyone, nor did I expect to. The solitude was part of the appeal. That afternoon, as I was chopping some firewood for the evening, I noticed something odd. There were faint footprints in the dirt near the cabin, impressions that didn't match mine. They were irregular, not human-shaped exactly, more like boots but wider, deeper. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe the previous renter had walked around, or perhaps an animal. But I knew that the last person who had been here had been gone for weeks, and these tracks were fresh. I followed them a little, but they vanished quickly into the forest, leaving me with a strange unease I couldn't shake. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hiker, maybe someone who had passed by. I wasn't alone in the forest after all, and the trail was public. That evening, I cooked another simple meal and settled by the stove. The wind had picked up, rattling the cabin roof and shaking the thin curtains. I was reading one of the dusty books when I heard it. A low scraping sound coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind, the branches brushing against the wood, but then it came again. Slower this time, deliberate, like someone was dragging something. My stomach turned. I turned off my reading light and listened. There it was again, closer now. I couldn't see outside without stepping onto the porch, but every instinct in my body screamed at me not to go out there. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously looked out the window. Nothing. The forest was dark, shadowed, silent. No one was there, but the noise had stopped only for a moment. Then I heard it again, unmistakable this time. A low, dragging scrape against the side of the cabin. My hands shook as I switched on the porch light and peered into the darkness. There was still nothing, only trees, their outlines jagged in the dim glow. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer scraping its antlers or a raccoon, something like that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was moving around me, just beyond my line of sight. That night, sleep was impossible. Every noise, the wind, the creak of the cabin, the occasional thump from the forest, set my heart racing. I lay awake, listening, imagining shapes in the dark corners of the room. The isolation that had felt like peace during the day became suffocating at night. I realized, with a creeping panic, that I was completely exposed. There was no one for miles to hear me if something happened. No cell service, no neighbors. Just me, the cabin, and whatever was out there. The next day, I tried to calm myself. I forced myself to go for another walk, sticking close to the cabin. I checked the surrounding area carefully and noticed more signs. Disturbed brush, small scratches on the bark of some trees, and more of those odd tracks near the creek. They weren't animal tracks. They were too deep, too deliberate, like someone heavy had been walking carefully to avoid leaving obvious traces. My unease deepened. I considered leaving, but the nearest town was hours away, and the weather was beginning to turn cold. I convinced myself to stay, reasoning that panic could make me imagine things that weren't there. That evening, I made sure all the windows and doors were locked. I stacked the wood neatly against the wall, keeping it within reach of the stove so I could have warmth all night. I left my flashlight on the table and my knife within arm's reach. But no matter what I did, the silence of the cabin felt wrong. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of a faint tapping, coming from the window closest to the bed. My first thought was that it was a branch hitting the glass. I held my breath and listened. Then it came again, more deliberately, a steady rhythm that wasn't random. My stomach dropped. Someone or something was outside. I didn't move for a long time, just listening, trying to decide whether I should investigate or wait it out. The tapping stopped, and I thought maybe I had been imagining it, until I heard the slow scrape of a boot against the porch boards. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the porch. The beam landed on a shadow, tall and bulky, just at the edge of the porch, almost blending into the darkness of the trees. I froze. For a while, nothing happened. Then the shadow moved, stepping closer, slow and deliberate. My mind raced. I had no cell signal. The nearest road was miles away. If someone forced their way in, there was no one to help me. I realized I had to act. Quietly, I opened the cabinet where I kept extra firewood and grabbed the heaviest piece. I waited, flashlight trembling in my other hand. The shadow stopped, just outside the light, and then turned, moving toward the edge of the forest. I didn't follow. I stayed still until the sound of movement faded completely into the night. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear. I barely slept, staying awake and alert, checking every window, listening for any sound. Morning didn't bring much relief. The forest was quiet, but I knew the tracks I had seen yesterday weren't going to vanish. I spent the day preparing. I reinforced the door as best I could with extra wood, collected all the sharp tools I could find, and kept my flashlight and knife with me at all times. I made a plan. If someone tried to come in, I would barricade myself in the bedroom, wait for them to leave, and then make my escape along the back trail that led to a more open area. That night, the tapping came again, and I recognized the shadow at the window immediately. My pulse raced. This time, I didn't hesitate. I slammed the door shut and used the heaviest furniture to block it. The shadow pressed against the wood, and I could hear the scrape of boots and the dull thud of force. Continued for a long, torturous while until finally it moved away. I didn't dare leave the room. I waited until dawn, too exhausted and terrified to think clearly, just listening for any sign of movement. When morning came, I ventured outside carefully. The tracks led away from the cabin, back into the denser parts of the forest. Whoever or whatever had been there had left in the night. I could see the disturbance in the dirt, where someone had dragged something heavy, perhaps a backpack, perhaps more. I gathered my courage and began packing immediately. I would leave this place no matter what. The fear I had managed to suppress before now consumed me completely. I loaded everything into my car, checking the surrounding forest constantly. The tracks were all around, but there was no one in sight. I drove away slowly, checking the rearview mirror constantly. The forest seemed endless, stretching in all directions, but I stuck to the road. I didn't stop, not even to look at the cabin one last time. The trees seemed to close in behind me, like they were hiding the secrets of what had happened there. Hours later, I finally reached the town, pulling into a gas station and shaking as I filled my tank. The lights of civilization, the presence of other people, were overwhelming and comforting after the solitude of the cabin. I reported the footprints to the local authorities, but without evidence, they could do nothing. I didn't go back. Weeks later, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, about the scraping, about the shadow. It had been a weekend meant for peace and isolation, but it had become one of the most frightening experiences of my life. I realized the forest was not empty, not really. It could be beautiful, but it could also hide dangers that no preparation could entirely remove. And I knew I would never go back because the memory of that night, the sound of boots on the porch, the shadow at the window, the unshakable feeling of being watched, would never leave me. I eventually sold all my camping gear and decided that some isolation was better enjoyed with company, in places where someone could hear you if you screamed. The cabin taught me something important. Solitude in nature is not the same as safety. Beauty can hide danger, and the line between calm and terror is thinner than you might think. I never found out who had been at the cabin that night, but the memory remains, etched vividly in my mind, a constant reminder of the precariousness of being completely alone in the wilderness. It started as a trip I had been planning for months, one that I thought would be simple and peaceful. I had found a cabin for rent deep in the woods, far enough from the city to feel isolated but close enough that I could get help if I needed it. I had packed my car the night before, carefully arranging everything I thought I might need. Food that wouldn't spoil, a small first aid kit, water, matches, extra blankets, a flashlight, batteries, a map, and some tools. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, only that I would be in the mountains, because I wanted the solitude, the quiet that only the forest could give. The drive there was longer than I expected, winding through narrow roads that twisted and turned with sharp curves, flanked by dense trees. The sun was already low when I finally reached the small dirt path that led to the cabin. I had read about the place online, seen the photos, and the cabin looked exactly like it had in the pictures. Small, wooden, with a stone chimney and a porch that wrapped around the front. A few trees had fallen nearby, and there were signs of wildlife all around. Scratches on the bark, paw prints in the mud. I parked my car, feeling the immediate shift from the hum of the city to the quiet of the forest. It was the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every small sound. At first, settling in felt natural. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to arrange things inside the cabin. The wooden floors creaked under my feet, and the smell of aged wood and smoke filled the air. I stacked the firewood neatly near the fireplace and checked the small propane heater to make sure it worked. The kitchen was small but functional, with a stove, a sink, and a few cabinets stocked with old but usable dishes. The bedroom was even smaller, with a bed, a thin mattress, and a window that looked out over the forest. I set up my sleeping area with the blankets and extra pillows, making it as comfortable as I could. The first night passed quietly, though it was not without its small alarms. The wind picked up, and I could hear it shaking the trees outside. Something brushed against the cabin at one point, though I couldn't see what it was. It might have been an animal. My mind played tricks on me in the dark, the isolation amplifying every noise. Still, I reminded myself that I was alone by choice. I had spent hours hiking in the woods during the day, mapping the area in my mind, noting landmarks and potential hazards. I felt safe enough, or at least comfortable with the level of risk. The second day, I decided to explore further. I hiked along a narrow trail that ran beside a stream, moving slowly and keeping my eyes open for signs of wildlife or anything unusual. The forest was alive with small sounds. The chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. I had brought a small notebook to jot down observations, noting tracks in the mud and markings on the trees that looked like old scars from falling branches. By mid-afternoon, I had gone farther than I intended. I realized that I had lost sight of the cabin. I checked my compass and map, retracing my steps slowly, careful not to panic. When I returned, I felt relieved but also a little shaken. The sun was setting, and shadows stretched across the forest floor, making familiar paths look strange and unfamiliar. I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat close, trying to calm myself. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I told myself it was the isolation making my imagination run wild. The third day was when things started to feel off. I woke early, around 5 in the morning, because the wind had picked up again. I went outside to check on the surroundings. The sky was gray, clouds hanging low, and the forest looked damp from the overnight drizzle. I noticed something strange on the dirt path leading to the cabin. Fresh tire tracks, but not from a car like mine. They were wider, deeper, and they headed in the direction of the cabin. My stomach sank. Someone had been there, or someone was coming. I double-checked the cabin, walking around it slowly, looking for signs of forced entry, but there was nothing. No broken locks, no windows smashed, nothing to suggest someone had entered while I was inside. Despite this, I couldn't ignore the tracks. I decided to stay inside for the day, checking the perimeter and making small changes to protect myself. I locked the cabin doors as securely as I could, even though they had simple latches. I moved the car closer to block the path, just in case. Hours passed slowly, and the tension was unbearable. I kept glancing out the window at the forest, listening to every sound. A branch snapping, a bird taking flight, leaves rustling under something heavy. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. By evening, I thought I had calmed down enough to make dinner. I was chopping vegetables when I heard it. A slow, deliberate scraping noise on the side of the cabin. My heart froze. It wasn't a branch falling, it wasn't the wind. It was something deliberate, moving carefully along the wall of the cabin. I froze, holding the knife in my hand, straining my ears. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I didn't dare go outside. I sat on the floor near the window, flashlight in hand, watching. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. The night was the worst. I didn't sleep. Every few minutes, I thought I heard footsteps around the cabin, slow and heavy. I stayed close to the fireplace, keeping the flashlight within reach, my heart racing so fast it hurt. Occasionally, I would hear a low, dragging sound across the dirt path outside, and I could feel my panic rising. I realized that I had no way to call for help. Cell service was non-existent in that area, and the cabin didn't have a landline. I thought about leaving, but the darkness and the unknown forest made it feel like stepping into a trap. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed only the essentials. My phone, even if it didn't work, a small bag of food, water, and my flashlight. I intended to hike back to the main road and find a way to get help or at least leave the area. I moved cautiously, checking the surrounding forest, noting any movements. The tracks from the previous day were still visible, deeper and more pronounced now, like someone had spent the night moving back and forth. I followed a small stream uphill, thinking it would lead me to a road or clearer path. Hours passed. I was tired, hungry, and every noise made me jump. I started hearing voices, or at least the sound of someone speaking far off in the distance. I couldn't make out the words, but it reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. The forest felt hostile now, each tree a potential hiding place, each shadow a threat. I kept moving, slipping over roots and rocks, cutting my hands on branches, my skin scratched and bruised. By late afternoon, I stumbled onto a small dirt road. Relief washed over me, but I stayed cautious, watching for any sign that I was being followed. Eventually, a car came down the road, and I waved frantically. The driver stopped, eyes wide, and I climbed in without hesitation. I explained as best I could, my voice shaking. They nodded, clearly understanding the seriousness, and drove me to the nearest town where I could contact the authorities. Later, I returned to the cabin with a police officer. What we found confirmed my worst fears. The tracks had been made by someone driving a large truck, someone who had clearly been watching the cabin for days. There were signs around the property. Small piles of stones, broken branches arranged oddly, subtle markers meant to indicate someone's presence. There were no signs of a break-in, but everything pointed to being stalked. Whoever had been watching me was gone by the time the authorities arrived. The officer told me that the area was known for occasional hunters and trespassers, but the calculated nature of the marks suggested someone more dangerous, someone methodical. I never returned to that cabin. I sold my gear, stopped hiking alone in remote areas, and learned to respect the isolation in a new way. I also realized how vulnerable I had been, how easy it was for someone to observe and manipulate my perception without me even knowing. That experience stayed with me for years, the memory of that night, the scraping outside the cabin, the weight of the forest pressing in, the absolute, terrifying silence punctuated only by deliberate, threatening sounds. Even now, years later, when I walk in the woods or hear strange noises at night, I think about that cabin. I think about how fragile our sense of safety can be when we isolate ourselves. But I also carry a strange sense of accomplishment. I survived, I stayed alert, and I acted carefully. The ending, while harrowing, was clear. I left, I avoided confrontation, and I took the proper precautions to ensure I was safe. It wasn't about heroics. It was about awareness, patience, and survival. Looking back, I realized the forest had never been the enemy. It was simply a place full of life, indifferent to humans. The real danger had been another person, someone with intent, someone willing to follow, watch, and wait. The forest had been my cover, my refuge, and my trap all at once. I learned to trust my instincts, to respect the signs, and to never assume that isolation equates to safety. And in that lesson, I found a clarity that I carry with me to this day. I never liked being alone in the wilderness, but there was something about that old cabin that drew me in. It wasn't much, just a small, wooden structure tucked into a clearing deep in the forest, miles away from any road or town. The paint was peeling, the roof sagging in places, and the windows were coated with layers of grime. I had rented it online through a small local listing, attracted by the promise of solitude, a chance to disconnect, and, I had to admit, a bit of adventure. I didn't realize how intense that adventure would be. The first day was calm. The drive-in had been long, along a narrow, winding dirt road that dipped and twisted through dense stands of pines and oaks. I had passed one other car the entire way, and even that seemed odd to me. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, the call of a distant bird, or the soft scurrying of something small across the underbrush. When I finally reached the cabin, the late afternoon light was soft and golden, filtering through the trees in streams of warmth that made the forest feel almost inviting. I unpacked slowly, carrying my bags inside. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke, as if someone had once lived there and left in a hurry. The interior was sparse, 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen with a rusty stove and a sink that barely worked, a living area with a sagging couch and a small wooden table. I set my things down, ran a quick check on the water and gas, and then decided to take a walk around the property. The clearing was surrounded by thick forest on all sides. Behind the cabin, the trees grew close together, their trunks thick and tangled with vines. I could hear the distant sound of a creek, a soft gurgle through the undergrowth. I followed it for a while, noting how isolated I truly was. There were no trails, no signs of people other than the faint impression of tire tracks leading up to the cabin. I felt a small thrill at being so completely cut off from the rest of the world, alone with nothing but the trees, the creek, and the fading light. That night, I lit a small fire in the stove, the kind that only barely warmed the room, and I sat on the couch with a mug of coffee, listening to the forest settle in for the night. The darkness outside was absolute. Through the grimy windows, I could barely make out the shapes of the trees, and the sounds of small creatures moving in the underbrush made me both alert and uneasy. I kept thinking I saw movement just beyond the window, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But each time I strained my eyes, there was nothing. The wind shifted, the shadows danced, and the darkness pressed against the cabin from all sides. I went to bed early, trying to calm my mind, but sleep did not come easily. Every sound seemed amplified, every creak of the floorboards and whistle of the wind a warning. I awoke in the middle of the night to a sharp tapping sound at the window. My heart jumped, and I froze. I thought perhaps it was a branch swaying in the wind, but the sound continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I lay in bed, my eyes wide, listening to the tapping against the glass. stopped after a few minutes. When I finally worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there, just the blackness of the forest. I told myself it was nothing, that I was alone and the sounds were natural, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, I tried to distract myself with chores. I collected firewood from the surrounding forest, inspecting every piece of wood carefully, noticing the strange absence of small animals or birds around the cabin. The air was heavy and still, the usual forest noises muted in a way that felt wrong. As the day wore on, I explored further, walking along the creek and venturing deeper into the trees. I noticed remnants of old human activity, rusted cans, broken tools, and a few decaying wooden structures half swallowed by moss and vines. Nothing seemed recent, but the presence of past human life made the isolation feel heavier, like the forest had been here long before me and would continue long after. It was on that second night that the tension escalated. I was cooking dinner on the small stove, the light flickering against the wooden walls, when I heard a heavy, deliberate footstep outside. The sound was distinct. Not a deer, not a small animal. Something large, moving slowly but steadily. My pulse quickened. I froze, listening, straining to hear over the hiss of the stove. Another step, then another, crunching the fallen leaves just beyond the window. I checked every window and door, all locked. The forest outside was black, but the sound persisted for a few minutes before fading. My imagination ran wild, envisioning someone or something moving just beyond the trees. I tried to convince myself it was probably just a deer or another large animal, but instinctively, I felt the need to protect myself. Sleep that night was nearly impossible. I lay awake on the couch, the fire in the stove reduced to glowing embers, listening to the forest. Every snap, every rustle, every whisper of the wind kept me on edge. At some point, I fell into a restless doze, only to be awakened again by movement outside. This time it was closer. Something was walking along the edge of the clearing. I could hear the crunch of dirt and leaves, a sound too methodical to be an animal. I stayed perfectly still, heart racing, waiting. The sound stopped abruptly. Silence returned, thick and heavy, pressing against the walls. I spent the following day in a heightened state of alert, refusing to go far from the cabin. I checked my phone, hoping for a signal. Nothing. I tried to calm myself, but the sense of being observed never left me. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, I gathered more firewood and barricaded the doors with the few pieces of furniture I could move. I checked every window, closing curtains and sealing gaps with rags. I could hear nothing at first, but as darkness fell, faint sounds began to drift through the trees again. Footsteps, branches snapping, leaves rustling. Then something different, a low, deliberate scraping sound against the side of the cabin. My stomach dropped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. It lasted only a moment, then stopped. I spent the night in a tense, sleepless vigilance, jumping at every sound. The morning never came soon enough. When daylight finally arrived, I forced myself to leave the cabin. I needed supplies, food, anything. I drove slowly along the dirt road, eyes constantly scanning the forest. The feeling of being followed lingered, but in daylight it seemed less threatening. I passed another car far in the distance, but it didn't stop. There was a small general store at the edge of a town about 20 minutes away, where I picked up supplies and food, trying to shake the tension that had taken hold in the cabin. That night, I returned to the cabin, determined to understand what was happening. As I approached, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud leading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin. They were human, adult-sized, but there were no other signs, no broken branches, no discarded items, just the footprints. My stomach churned. I entered cautiously, checking every corner, every window, but found nothing. My mind raced with questions. Had someone been watching the cabin for days? Why? Over the next 2 days, I tried to rationalize everything. The forest is quiet, the area remote, maybe someone had wandered through, someone living off the grid. I stayed inside during the day, kept a fire burning at night, and stayed alert. The sounds continued, always subtle but unnerving. Footsteps at the edge of the clearing, branches snapping, something moving just beyond sight. I never saw anyone, never heard voices, just the constant feeling of being watched. On the fourth night, it escalated again. I had gone to bed early, but sleep was impossible. Around midnight, I heard movement outside, louder this time, deliberate. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a heavy wrench from the kitchen, and crept to the window. Outside, in the pale light of the moon filtering through the trees, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Not moving, not hiding, just standing and watching. My hands shook, and for a moment I froze. Then the figure started walking toward the cabin, slow, deliberate steps. I retreated into the back of the cabin, heart hammering. I could hear the steps approaching the porch. The doorknob rattled once, twice. I braced myself, wrench in hand. The door shook, then stopped. Silence. I held my breath, straining to hear. After what felt like hours, the sound of footsteps retreated back into the forest. Morning brought light, and with it, clarity. I had spent days isolated, jumpy, exhausted, and terrified. I realized the situation was too dangerous. Whatever had been watching the cabin, it wasn't going to stop. I packed quickly, checked the locks one last time, and left without looking back. I drove as fast as I could along the winding dirt road, my eyes constantly scanning the trees, my mind racing with thoughts of what might have happened if I had stayed another night. When I finally reached the highway, the safety of traffic and distance brought a sense of relief. I stopped at a diner, ordered coffee, and sat for a long while, letting the tension drain from my body. I reported the situation to the local authorities, describing the footprints and the strange disturbances, but there was little they could do. The area was remote, vast, and sparsely patrolled. I knew, deep down, that the cabin was abandoned, but that someone had chosen it as their hiding place, watching from the forest, using the isolation to their advantage. I never returned. Months later, I heard from a local that the cabin had been rented out again, and that people occasionally reported strange noises and footsteps at night. I shivered at the thought. That experience stayed with me for a long time. The isolation, the constant sense of being observed, the fear that someone was close enough to touch me without me ever seeing them clearly. It taught me to respect the wilderness, not for its beauty, but for the unpredictability of other humans who choose to live unseen. Even now, years later, I remember the way the forest pressed against the cabin, the way the darkness seemed alive, the slow, deliberate footsteps that echoed in my mind long after I left. I learned that fear in isolation isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about knowing someone could be there, watching, moving, planning, and that you might not even know it until it's too late. I never stayed in a remote cabin alone again, and I never underestimated the silence of the forest. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing is not what you see, but what is hiding just beyond sight, waiting, patient, and perfectly still, until the moment it chooses to reveal itself. I had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. The idea of leaving the city behind, escaping the constant noise, the sirens, the flashing lights, the endless buzzing of electronics, was more than a temptation. It was a necessity. I drove north in my old SUV, a car that had seen better days, along roads that grew narrower and quieter as the city fell behind me. The air changed gradually, the concrete and asphalt giving way to the scent of pine and wet earth. By late afternoon, the sun was low, cutting long shadows between the trees, and I found the last turnoff that led to the cabin. The cabin was small, built of dark logs that had begun to weather with age. It sat in a clearing surrounded by thick forest on all sides, far enough from the road that a single car passing might go unnoticed. The windows were dusty, streaked with rain from the previous storm. The roof sloped sharply, and a stone chimney rose from one side, darkened with soot. A small porch ran along the front, with a wooden swing that creaked slightly in the wind. It looked abandoned, though not in a way that suggested someone had left in a hurry. It looked like it had been left for nature to slowly reclaim. I parked my SUV just outside the clearing and stepped out. The air was heavy with the smell of wet pine and soil, with a faint tang of smoke from a distant fire, maybe a campfire from another traveler. I took a deep breath and carried my backpack toward the cabin. The boards beneath my feet groaned, and I realized the porch hadn't been maintained for years. I shook off the feeling of unease. It was just a cabin, empty, quiet, simple. That's what I wanted. Solitude, silence, a place to write, to think, to feel the edges of life that the city smoothed over. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old furniture. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through the grimy windows. The floorboards creaked with every step. There was a small table near the kitchen corner, a couple of chairs, a simple bed tucked into the corner of the room. A wood-burning stove stood against one wall, cold and blackened with use. I set my backpack down and walked around, inspecting. The walls were bare except for a single shelf with a few rusted cans of food and some jars of spices. The water pump in the kitchen corner looked old but intact. A small bathroom at the back had a toilet and a sink. There was no electricity, no running water except what could be pumped from the well outside. This was exactly what I wanted. Isolation. The first night came quietly, though not peacefully. I had prepared a small fire, stacked logs next to the stove, and as the fire grew, I felt the warmth seep into my bones. The forest outside the windows was dark, impenetrable. Every rustle, every snap of a branch seemed amplified. It was impossible to tell what was animal and what was just the wind. The shadows shifted, forming shapes my mind insisted on recognizing as human, though I knew there were none. I forced myself to focus on writing, on the pages in my notebook, but sleep came in fits. Every time I closed my eyes, the creaks of the cabin seemed louder. The sound of something brushing against the outer walls, maybe leaves or the branches, made my heart jump. But there was no one there, and I tried to remind myself of that. The next day, I decided to explore. The forest around the cabin was dense, the ground damp and soft. Moss covered the rocks, and the trees were old, their branches high and tangled. I walked along a narrow trail that seemed to lead downhill. The further I went, the quieter it became. I saw signs of animals, tracks in the mud, scratches on the bark of trees. Birds called somewhere above me, but not often. Felt like the forest was holding its breath. When I reached a small creek, the water was clear and cold, and I knelt to drink and splash my face. The isolation hit me fully at that moment. The kind of silence you feel in your chest, heavy and alive. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door to the back shed was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it that morning. My stomach sank, but I told myself it was probably the wind. I closed it firmly and checked the latch twice. I stacked more wood next to the stove and tried to shake off the unease. But that night, the sounds were worse. Not just the creaks of the cabin or the wind or the distant animals. There was a soft thump, rhythmic, almost deliberate, coming from outside. I stayed awake for hours, straining to hear it, but eventually exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. The following morning, I saw tracks around the cabin. Not animal tracks, larger, human-sized, pressed into the soft earth near the shed. Panic surged through me. Someone had been here. The shed door was open again, more than I remembered leaving it. I went inside carefully. Nothing seemed missing, nothing moved, though I could see where someone had rifled through the shelves. It was like a test, a probe, not a robbery. Whoever had been here didn't touch my food, my firewood, my personal items. Just the shed. My mind raced. Was it a hunter? Someone lost in the forest? Or something else? I decided I had to leave, but the nearest town was hours away. I couldn't just run into the forest blindly. I spent the day fortifying the cabin as best I could. I gathered rocks and stacked them near the windows, moved heavy furniture in front of doors, and kept a fire going constantly, for both warmth and as a signal in case someone came near. I sat by the window, watching the tree lean, my senses stretched taut. Every bird call, every snapping branch made me jump. I checked the tracks again. They hadn't disappeared. In fact, I noticed new ones forming alongside the older prints. Whoever it was had returned, or perhaps never left. That night was the worst. I stayed awake, clutching a kitchen knife I had brought from the car, sitting near the stove. The thumps returned, louder this time, then a scraping at the back door. My heart thumped so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't move, didn't breathe more than necessary. After a long, tense period, it stopped. I waited, hours, staring at the shadows, until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. When I finally dared to step outside, I discovered the cause of the noise. Someone had tried to dig under the cabin's porch, to reach the foundation or perhaps something hidden beneath. There were marks of tools, shallow holes, and freshly turned earth. Whoever had done this was methodical, careful. They had been watching me, testing the cabin's defenses. Fear tightened my chest. I realized I couldn't stay here another night. The place was no longer safe. I packed my essentials quickly, keeping the knife in hand, and prepared to drive out as soon as possible. Before I left, I wanted one last check. The shed still open. As I entered, my stomach sank further. Inside were remnants of a small camp. A blanket, an empty can, a piece of rope. They had been here waiting. I felt a mix of fear and relief. Fear that they had been so close, and relief that they had left before anything escalated. I grabbed a few logs from the shed and stacked them outside, a primitive signal or barrier. I knew it wouldn't stop them, but it felt necessary, a final act of control in a situation where I had so little. I got in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The forest swallowed the cabin, the tracks, and the shed. For hours, I drove without stopping, through winding roads and empty stretches of forest. My hands ached from gripping the wheel, my stomach churned from adrenaline, but the road led me out. By late evening, I was back in a small town. I checked into a motel, had a shower, and finally let myself breathe. Later, when I returned home, I filed a report with the local authorities describing the tracks, the shed, the attempted digging. They promised to patrol the area, though I knew it might be months before anyone checked. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who had been there or why, but I learned something crucial about isolation. It can make you feel free, but it also makes you vulnerable in ways the city can't. That weekend left me shaken, but alive, and more aware of the thin line between peace and danger. The memory of the forest, the tracks, the quiet, still haunts me. Not in dreams, but in the way I notice every sound, every shadow, every rustle in the trees when I am alone. I decided to take a break from the city life and escape into the woods for a week. I had rented a small cabin that sat on the edge of a dense forest, far from any towns or neighbors. The idea was simple. No noise, no people, just silence and the sound of nature. I wanted to recharge, write, and be alone with my thoughts. I drove for hours, the asphalt eventually giving way to gravel roads that twisted through endless trees. As I approached the cabin, a sense of isolation washed over me. The structure itself was old but solid, built from dark weathered wood, with a steep roof and a narrow porch that creaked under my weight. Windows were small and dusty, but they gave a glimpse of the forest surrounding the cabin in all directions. The first day passed slowly. I unpacked my bags, explored the small yard, and settled into a routine of organizing supplies and inspecting the cabin. It had basic amenities: a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, a sink, a small bathroom with a shower, and 2 bedrooms. There was no cell service, just the distant, occasional hum of a generator somewhere far away, and that barely reached the cabin. That evening, I lit the stove, cooked a simple meal, and sat in a chair near the window, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The forest was silent but alive. Occasional birds flew between the branches, and the wind whispered softly through the leaves. The second day, I decided to explore the nearby area. The cabin came with a small map, showing a few trails and a river about a mile away. I packed water, a small backpack, and a flashlight just in case. The trail was overgrown in some parts, with thorny bushes scraping at my arms as I pushed through. Birds flitted overhead, and squirrels darted along the trees, making soft rustling noises. The forest floor was uneven, covered with fallen leaves, branches, and loose rocks. After nearly an hour, I reached the river. The water ran clear, cold, and fast over the rocks. I spent a while sitting on the riverbank, watching the water swirl and listening to the sounds of the forest. The isolation was comforting, but I felt an uneasy awareness of how alone I was. I returned to the cabin before sunset. On the way back, I noticed the forest seemed quieter, almost too quiet. The usual bird calls were absent, and there were no small animal sounds. Shadows from the trees stretched long, twisting across the path in ways that seemed unnatural. I told myself it was just the light playing tricks. I kept walking, but a sense of unease settled in my chest. By the time I reached the cabin, it was dark, and I was glad to see the small wooden structure standing where I had left it. I lit a few lanterns inside and double-checked that all windows and doors were securely closed. The third day, I focused on chores and writing. The cabin had been empty for years, and there was a layer of dust and cobwebs in corners and shelves. I cleaned as much as I could, swept the floor, wiped counters, and organized my things. While cleaning, I found something strange. On the floor under a cabinet in the kitchen, there were footprints in the dust. They were small, adult-sized, and led from the back door to the living room, ending just near the stove. I froze, staring at them. I was alone when I arrived. There had been no one else. I examined the back door, locked and undisturbed. The footprints made no sense. They were faint, like someone had stepped in dust elsewhere and walked carefully to avoid disturbing the rest of the floor. I tried to reason it out. Perhaps a previous renter had left them and the dust settled strangely? But the lines were too fresh and clear for that. I spent the evening more tense than usual, checking locks, peeking out windows, and keeping a makeshift baseball bat close by. I didn't hear anyone or anything, but sleep came reluctantly. On the fourth day, the weather changed. The sky darkened in the morning, and a thick layer of clouds blocked the sun. A cold wind blew through the trees, rattling branches against the roof. I decided to stay inside and work on writing. As the hours passed, I noticed the sound of footsteps outside. Not distant, but very close, walking around the perimeter of the cabin. My heart raced. I went to the window, careful to stay hidden, and saw nothing. No people, no movement, just the thick forest. The footsteps stopped after a few minutes. I considered leaving, but the gravel road was slippery, and the forest around the cabin was dense and unfamiliar. I was trapped in the sense of isolation, forced to wait and watch. The night that followed was tense. Every small noise seemed amplified. The groan of the cabin's beams, the wind in the trees, the occasional snapping of a branch. I kept the lanterns on, the bat within reach, and my senses sharp. Around midnight, I heard a tapping on the window. I froze. The sound was soft, deliberate. I didn't move. Another tap, then silence. My mind raced. Could it be an animal? Possibly a bear or raccoon. But the taps were too precise, too rhythmic. I didn't dare open the curtains to look. The fifth day, I knew I needed to explore and figure out what was happening. I packed the bat, a knife, water, and some food, and went outside to check the surroundings. I started around the cabin's perimeter. There were footprints, fresh this time. They circled the cabin in no particular direction, going into the woods at one point and returning. Some were bare, others in boots. Whoever or whatever had been here had been careful to avoid leaving a trail back to the road. My pulse raced. I realized this was not an animal. I spent hours inspecting, noting every detail, every branch broken, every stone moved. The forest itself seemed to shift around me, shadows stretching and bending as the wind moved through the trees. I couldn't tell which sounds were natural and which were signs of someone else being there. The realization sank in that I might not be alone. That night, sleep was nearly impossible. Every creak, every gust of wind, every distant snap of a branch felt threatening. I stayed awake, bat in hand, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something different. Footsteps approaching the cabin, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside the door. My heart pounded. I held my breath. The doorknob rattled softly, Someone was trying the handle. I backed away silently and considered my options. There was no phone signal, no way to call for help. I thought about climbing out a window, but the windows were high and the ground uneven. Hours passed. I stayed crouched, tense, alert, until the first signs of dawn. I heard movement outside, someone leaving. I didn't dare step outside until the sun was fully up. When I did, the ground around the cabin told a story. Footprints, deep impressions, showing a person circling and leaving in the direction of the forest. No one had come back. I inspected the windows and doors. All were intact, nothing broken. Whoever had been there had entered and exited quietly. I decided then that I had to leave, but the forest was vast, and I had no idea where the nearest road was. I packed everything quickly, loaded the car, and started driving along the gravel path I had taken to reach the cabin. The forest seemed endless, the road narrow, but I finally saw signs of civilization. A paved road, a gas station in the distance. I stopped there, checked my phone. Signal returned. I called the rental agency, explained everything, and reported the cabin. They told me that the place had been abandoned for months and that no one had lived there for years. The footprints, they said, were unexplainable. In the following days, I learned from local authorities that the forest around that cabin was occasionally used by hunters and hikers, but the isolation made it a place where trespassers could go unnoticed. They suggested that someone might have entered the cabin while I was away on my hike, though they couldn't find evidence. I realized that I had narrowly avoided a confrontation that could have been dangerous. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a lingering unease. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of the sounds at night, the precise tapping, the footprints circling the cabin. I read articles and reports about isolated cabins and the risks of being alone in such places. It became clear that the danger wasn't supernatural, wasn't imagined. It was real. Someone had been there. Someone could have been watching. I realized the forest's beauty was matched by its indifference to human life, and that isolation, which I had once craved, came with risks I had underestimated. Eventually, I stopped going into isolated areas for long periods. The experience taught me to respect the wilderness in ways I hadn't before, to understand the difference between solitude and vulnerability. The cabin itself was later locked and abandoned again. I never returned. I kept the memories, the fear, and the lesson close, understanding that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They're real people, real dangers, and the quiet spaces where no one can hear you scream. I had been planning this trip for months, carefully choosing a cabin deep in the forest, far from any roads, stores, or neighbors. The thought of isolation excited me. I wanted a real escape, a place where I could feel completely alone with my thoughts, away from the constant noise and demands of the city. I had checked the map countless times, noting the winding dirt roads, the streams, and the dense patches of trees that would mark the final stretch of the journey. The cabin was advertised as rustic, off-grid, and accessible only by a narrow path that cut through the thickest parts of the forest. From the photos online, it looked perfect. A small wooden structure with a stone fireplace, a single lofted bedroom, and a porch that overlooked a clearing surrounded by towering pines. I told myself I wanted solitude, and I was willing to embrace the challenge of being entirely self-reliant for a few days. I arrived in late afternoon. The sun was already leaning low, its golden light cutting through the trees in sharp streaks. The last mile to the cabin was rougher than I expected. The path had grown narrow and rocky, and I had to maneuver around fallen branches and puddles from the recent rain. The air smelled damp and earthy, and the quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I remember thinking it was the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of every sound your body made. The crunch of my boots on the dirt, the snap of a twig underfoot, even my own breathing seemed loud in the stillness. When I finally reached the cabin, my first impression was relief. It was exactly as the photos suggested, and more. The wooden walls looked sturdy, the chimney was intact, and the small porch held a stack of firewood neatly piled against one corner. I parked my car on a flat patch of ground nearby, noting the uneven terrain that would make any vehicle breakdown a serious problem. I unloaded my gear slowly, wanting to take it all in. The smell of pine resin, the fresh air, the subtle hum of life in the forest. It was beautiful, almost too quiet, and I immediately felt a thrill of freedom mixed with something like unease, the kind you feel when you realize you are completely cut off from the rest of the world. The cabin's interior was small but functional. The living space had a rough-hewn wooden table, a couple of chairs, and the fireplace dominating one wall. The loft bedroom was accessible by a short ladder, the mattress thin but clean. I had brought my own supplies: food, water, a small camping stove, lanterns, and extra batteries. I unpacked methodically, making sure everything was stored safely. I set the lantern on the table, leaving it ready for nightfall, and stacked firewood next to the fireplace. There was a small window that faced the clearing outside, and I spent several minutes just looking out, noting the shadows beginning to stretch across the forest floor. The sun dipped below the treetops, and the world outside shifted from gold to deepening gray. That night, I made a fire in the fireplace, relishing the crackling warmth and the faint scent of burning wood. I cooked a simple meal, listening to the sounds outside, distant bird calls, the rustle of small animals, the occasional groan of the trees as the wind passed through them. I went to bed early, feeling exhausted from the drive and the hike in. The loft felt cozy, the mattress firm but comfortable, and the cool air slipping through the window was refreshing rather than unpleasant. I drifted off to sleep to the rhythm of the forest, unaware of how sharply my solitude would soon turn into something much more intense. I woke in the middle of the night to a subtle noise. It was faint, almost like scraping, coming from outside. My initial thought was that it was a deer or another animal, moving through the clearing or brushing against the cabin. I listened, holding my breath, but the noise stopped almost immediately. I waited, staring out into the darkness, the only light coming from the stars overhead and the faint glow of the moon through the trees. Everything was still again, and eventually, I managed to fall back asleep, convincing myself that my imagination had conjured the sound. The next day, I tried to relax, telling myself that the forest would feel safer in daylight. I explored the area around the cabin, noting the creek that ran a few hundred feet away, the thick clusters of trees, and the uneven ground that would make walking tricky at night. I collected some dry branches for the fireplace, took photographs of the landscape, and prepared a list of tasks to keep myself busy over the next few days. By late afternoon, I had chopped enough firewood for several nights, organized my supplies meticulously, and even cleaned the cabin thoroughly, leaving no trace of dirt or debris. That evening, the feeling of unease returned, stronger this time. The forest, which had seemed calm during the day, now felt almost alive in a threatening way. Shadows moved differently in the firelight. The wind carried subtle, unfamiliar sounds. I convinced myself to ignore it, telling myself it was the natural sounds of the woods, but I couldn't shake the tension building in my chest. I lit the fireplace early and sat close, the warmth comforting but also isolating. I made another simple meal, ate quickly, and checked my supplies again, making sure nothing was missing or out of place. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, the sound was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate scraping, like someone dragging a heavy object across the ground outside. My heart pounded. I stayed very still, straining to hear. The sound paused, then started again, closer this time, circling the cabin. I froze, realizing that this was not an animal. My mind raced, trying to think logically. There were no other cabins nearby, no roads that anyone could have driven down. Whoever or whatever it was moving silently and deliberately, testing the boundaries of my isolation. I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy stick I had brought for emergencies. I considered going outside to confront whoever it might be, but a sense of survival instinct held me back. Instead, I quietly checked all the windows and doors, ensuring they were locked and secure. The scraping continued for nearly an hour, starting and stopping unpredictably. Each time it grew louder, then faded into the darkness. I realized I was not just being watched, I was being stalked. Sleep became impossible. I sat awake for hours, listening and trying to track the movement of whatever was outside. I noticed subtle changes. Footprints in the soft dirt outside the porch, small broken branches along the edges of the clearing, and shadows moving in ways that made no sense. My mind cycled between fear and rationalization, trying desperately to convince myself that this was just someone passing by or an animal. But the methodical pattern of the sounds and the proximity of the footprints suggested otherwise. By the next morning, I was exhausted, jittery, and hyper-alert. I considered leaving immediately, but the path back to the main road was rough, and my car was parked more than a mile away. I knew any attempt to escape could be dangerous, especially if whoever had been circling the cabin was still around. I spent the day preparing, reinforcing the cabin as best as I could. I stacked furniture against the doors, created a barrier with firewood, and made sure I had multiple ways to defend myself if necessary. I also stocked the loft with essentials so I could retreat there quickly if needed. That night, the stalking resumed, more intense and deliberate. I could hear the footsteps pacing outside, the rustle of leaves, the creaking of branches under weight. I stayed in the loft, flashlight in hand, waiting. Hours passed. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my body tense and trembling. At some point, the sound stopped completely, and I dared not move for a long while, listening to the absolute silence that followed. It was only after what felt like an eternity that I finally allowed myself to breathe, realizing the threat had temporarily disappeared. The next morning, I decided that I could not wait any longer. I had to leave. I gathered my gear, carefully checking every corner for signs that someone, or something, had been inside. Nothing was disturbed. I made my way down the ladder, moving cautiously, and opened the cabin door. The clearing was empty, but the footprints in the dirt told a story of someone who had been circling the cabin all night. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the adrenaline rushing through me, and started the trek back to my car. Every snap of a twig, every shadow among the trees, made me flinch, but I moved steadily and silently, avoiding open areas whenever possible. I reached my car without incident, though my hands were trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I drove slowly at first, keeping my eyes on the forest edges for any sign that I was being followed. I drove down the dirt path over the rocky stretches and finally onto the main road. Only when the familiar asphalt of the highway appeared did I feel some measure of relief. The sense of isolation that had been thrilling now felt like a distant, dangerous memory. In the weeks that followed, I reflected on what had happened. I never discovered who had been circling the cabin, nor did I see any vehicles or signs of another person nearby. The experience left a mark on me, a reminder of how vulnerable one can be in complete isolation, how quickly solitude can turn into terror. I also realized the importance of preparation, awareness, and the respect one must have for the unknown risks of the wilderness. That cabin, once a symbol of escape and freedom, had become a place of confrontation with raw fear, and leaving it behind gave me a clarity I had never experienced before. I resolved to continue seeking solitude in nature, but with greater caution, understanding that isolation could be both a gift and a test of survival instincts. Even months later, I find myself replaying those nights in my mind. The quiet before the first sound, the slow scrape that circled the cabin, the tension that left me unable to sleep, the way I fortified the small wooden structure against an unseen threat. It taught me to appreciate the simple act of safety, the reassurance of roads and people nearby, and the value of vigilance. I returned to the forest many times after that, always in daylight, always aware of my surroundings, carrying with me the knowledge that fear is not always imagined and that isolation, while peaceful, can sometimes reveal the sharp edge of human vulnerability. I had been planning this solo trip for months. The idea was simple: disconnect completely from the city, the noise, the people, and immerse myself in the wilderness. I found a small cabin online, tucked deep in the mountains, far enough away from any town or road that I would have no distractions. The pictures were modest, just a small wooden structure with a tin roof, a stone chimney, and a tiny porch overlooking a creek. But I liked that. felt real, not commercialized. I packed everything I thought I would need. Food for a week, a tent in case the cabin was unusable, a first aid kit, extra batteries, a small propane stove, and plenty of water. I also brought a few small comforts: a notebook, pencils, and a few books. I left my phone on airplane mode once I hit the trail, wanting nothing but silence and the sounds of the forest. The drive up the mountain was uneventful, but by the time I reached the trailhead, it was early evening. I parked my car in the small dirt lot, unlocked my pack, and checked the map again. The cabin was supposed to be about 3 miles in, but the terrain was rough, and the trail wound tightly through thick pine forests and over uneven rocky paths. The air was sharp and smelled like pine needles and wet earth, the kind of scent that makes your chest tighten slightly because it is so pure, so untouched by human life. I began the hike just as the sun was setting. The sky was streaked with gold and red, and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. My steps crunched on dry leaves and twigs. I passed a few small streams, but otherwise the trail was silent. Birds were settling in for the night, and the occasional rustle of a small animal moving through the underbrush was the only sound beyond my own breathing. I carried a headlamp but didn't turn it on. I wanted to trust my eyes for as long as possible, to be aware of my surroundings. The last thing I wanted was to arrive at the cabin exhausted and disoriented in total darkness. As I walked, the air grew colder and the trees denser. I started to notice that the forest wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive. It felt like it had a presence, not alive in the sense of a being, but like it watched everything I did, silently observing. I shook off the feeling. I was used to being alone in nature, and paranoia would only make the hike harder. By the time I reached the creek the cabin overlooked, it was dark, and I had to use my headlamp. The water reflected the light in a way that made it look black except where the lamp hit ripples. I followed the narrow path along the creek, slipping on wet rocks occasionally until I saw it, a faint outline of the cabin ahead. Relief washed over me. The structure was exactly as it had appeared online. Small, unassuming, but sturdy. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the chimney leaned to one side, but it was livable. I set my pack down and took a deep breath. This was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, quiet, the chance to be completely alone. I spent the first night setting up. I unpacked the essentials, checked the propane stove, and laid out my sleeping bag on the cabin's small cot. Outside, the forest hummed with life, though in the darkness it was hard to distinguish what was moving. Every once in a while, I heard a branch snap far off in the woods. At first, I attributed it to animals. Bears and deer roamed these mountains, and the thought made me uneasy but not panicked. I kept my flashlight next to my bed and fell asleep with the door locked, thinking that would be enough. The next morning, I woke to a dense fog blanketing the creek. I stepped outside to stretch and noticed something odd. Footprints in the mud, heading along the path behind the cabin. They looked human, though I couldn't be sure. They were fresh, imprinted deeply, as though whoever had walked there had heavy boots. My first thought was hikers, but the trail was so remote that seeing someone else felt strange. I scanned the forest, trying to see if anyone was nearby, but the fog made it impossible to see more than 20 feet. The footprints continued along the creek, away from the cabin. I debated following them but decided against it. Whoever they were had left, and I had no reason to chase after strangers in the middle of the woods. The fog didn't lift that morning. I spent hours checking the area around the cabin, making sure everything was secure. That afternoon, I started feeling uneasy in a way that wasn't just about the footprints. Small things, branches breaking in unnatural patterns, the occasional shadow moving too fast, a sense that something had changed in the forest, made me hyper-aware. I reminded myself that animals could explain most noises, and the forest could play tricks with light and fog. Still, I couldn't shake a creeping sense of being watched. That evening, as I was cooking a small meal on the stove, I heard the first real warning sign. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. A tapping sound at the cabin's exterior wall, like someone lightly knocking, or maybe a branch brushing against the wood. I froze. The wind had picked up slightly, but the sound didn't move with the trees. It was consistent, rhythmic. I moved to the window and shined my flashlight outside. Nothing. The woods were empty, the fog thick. I went back to my stove, convincing myself it was nothing, and tried to focus on my meal. But the tapping continued, irregularly now, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. Each time I stopped moving, it seemed louder. By the third night, my nerves were frayed. The fog returned, thicker than before, and the forest seemed different. Shadows felt closer, and noises were sharper. The tapping had evolved into scratching, low, scraping sounds against the cabin's wooden exterior. I secured the doors and windows as best as I could, pushed my bed closer to the door with a fire extinguisher within reach, and stayed awake most of the night. Every few minutes, I heard something move outside. A branch snapping, gravel shifting, the sound of deliberate footsteps pacing near the cabin. The realization hit me slowly, with dread. Someone was outside, and they had been there for hours. The next morning, I dared to step outside. The fog lingered, and the forest was silent except for the occasional bird. But signs were clear, more footprints, now circling the cabin. Unlike the first ones, these were heavier, larger, and unmistakably human. They didn't seem random. They seemed deliberate, as though someone had spent the night tracking the perimeter. My stomach twisted. I considered hiking back immediately, but the trail was long, and the thought of walking alone with this person or people out there filled me with terror. My only option was to stay calm and plan carefully. I fortified the cabin as best I could. I stacked firewood near the doors to use as barricades, arranged heavy furniture against entrances, and kept my survival knife within reach. I spent the day monitoring the perimeter from windows, noting every sound, every movement. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, hiding whoever was out there. I didn't try to leave again. The only thought that ran through my head: survive until morning, when there might be enough light to hike out safely. That night was the worst. The scratching returned, louder, more persistent. There were now multiple sources: on the roof, on the walls, near the windows. I could hear soft mutterings through the fog, but couldn't make out words. My heart raced constantly. I stayed crouched in a corner with the knife ready, my ears straining for any clue to what was happening. Hours passed, each one feeling like a lifetime. The fog seemed to press against the cabin, muffling the world beyond, amplifying the isolation. At one point, I heard a heavy object thrown against the door, the sound reverberating through the walls. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just hoped that whatever it was would leave before it escalated further. Dawn finally arrived. The fog thinned slightly, revealing a scene that made me sick. Footprints were everywhere, circling the cabin like a trap. The firewood I had stacked was scattered, the windows scratched deeply, the door dented from blows. Whoever had been out there had spent the night close enough to watch me, close enough to strike if I had let my guard down. I realized then how lucky I was. Despite the terror, they hadn't broken in. Perhaps they were after something else entirely, or perhaps they simply wanted to scare me. Either way, I knew the forest was no longer a safe place. I didn't linger. I packed everything hastily but carefully, checking the cabin for traps, hidden objects, anything suspicious. I left no trace of my presence beyond the obvious signs of my occupation. As I hiked down the trail, every step felt like an escape. My legs ached. My body was sore from tension, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Occasionally, I glanced back through the thinning trees, half expecting to see someone following. There was no one, only the empty forest, silent except for birds and rustling leaves. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted, covered in mud and scratches from branches along the trail. I locked the doors, started the engine, and sat for a moment just breathing, trying to process everything. The cabin still sat deep in the mountains, seemingly peaceful now, but I knew the isolation had been deceptive. Alone, far from help, I had been entirely at the mercy of someone else's presence. The relief was overwhelming, the realization of survival more acute than anything else. Driving down the mountain, I kept glancing at the trees lining the road. I thought about the footprints, the night of scratching, the fog that had concealed everything. I knew I would never return to that cabin, and probably never venture alone into the wilderness again. But I also knew something else. I had survived. I had endured fear in its rawest, most realistic form, and I had emerged whole. That survival, that clarity, became the story I carried with me. The unshakable lesson that the wilderness is not just a beautiful escape, but a place where humans are profoundly vulnerable, and where one misstep, one lapse in caution, can have consequences far beyond imagination.